Welcome, friends, to a journey into the heart of darkness, a forgotten corner of history where survival was a daily miracle. We're about to delve into the Eastern Front of World War II, a theatre of war so vast, so brutal, that its sheer scale often overshadows the individual stories of courage and resilience that unfolded within its icy grip. Close your eyes for a moment, if you will. Imagine a battlefield stretching for thousands of miles, from the frozen plains of Russia to the scorched earth of Ukraine. Picture endless columns of men, locked in a desperate struggle for survival against the backdrop of a relentless, unforgiving landscape. This, my friends, was the Eastern Front. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It was a war unlike any other, a clash of ideologies fought with a ferocity that shocked even those hardened by years of conflict. The numbers alone are staggering, almost incomprehensible. Millions upon millions perished, both soldiers and civilians, swallowed by the insatiable maw of war. To put it into perspective, the Eastern Front accounted for an estimated 75 to 80% of all German military casualties during the Second World War. Think about that for a moment. The vast majority of the German war machine's losses came on this one front. But the statistics only tell part of the story. Behind each number lies a human life, a story of hope, fear, and unimaginable suffering. Mothers torn from their children, families starving in besieged cities, soldiers enduring unimaginable hardships in the face of relentless enemy fire. It was a war fought with a level of savagery that defied the conventions of civilized warfare. The ideological stakes were incredibly high. For Nazi Germany, the Eastern Front was about securing Lebensraum, living space, for the German people at the expense of the Soviet Union and its inhabitants. It was about racial supremacy, about the subjugation of an entire people. For the Soviet Union, it was a desperate fight for survival against an existential threat. It was about defending their homeland, their families, their very way of life. This clash of ideologies fueled a cycle of violence and retribution that spiraled out of control. Massacres, atrocities, and acts of unspeakable cruelty were commonplace on both sides. The rules of war, such as they were often disregarded. Prisoners were routinely executed, villages were razed to the ground, and civilians were deliberately targeted. The environment itself was also a formidable enemy. The brutal Russian winters, with temperatures plummeting to unimaginable lows, claimed countless lives. Soldiers froze to death in their trenches, their bodies becoming entombed in ice. The vast distances and poor infrastructure made it incredibly difficult to supply troops, leading to widespread starvation and disease. Muddy conditions during the spring and autumn rendered roads impassable, grinding military operations to a halt. The Eastern Front was a crucible, forging heroes and villains, victims and perpetrators. It was a place where ordinary people were forced to make extraordinary choices, often with life or death consequences. Survival was not guaranteed. It was a constant struggle against overwhelming odds. In the coming episodes, we will shine a light on some of these forgotten stories, the individual tales of courage, resilience, and sheer determination that emerged from the darkness of the Eastern Front. We'll hear first-hand accounts from soldiers, partisans, and civilians who lived through this horrific conflict, offering us a glimpse into their lives and the challenges they faced. We'll explore the initial shock of the German invasion, the desperate struggles for survival in the face of overwhelming enemy forces, the rise of partisan resistance movements, and the devastating sieges of cities like Leningrad and Stalingrad. We'll also examine the moral complexities of war, the difficult choices people had to make in order to survive, and the lasting psychological scars that remained long after the fighting stopped. These stories are not always easy to hear, but they are important. They remind us of the horrors of war, the resilience of the human spirit, and the importance of remembering the past so that we can learn from it and prevent such tragedies from happening again. So settle in, relax, and prepare to embark on a journey into the heart of the Eastern Front, a journey that will challenge your perceptions and leave you with a deeper understanding of the human cost of war. Hello and welcome back. Last time we touched on the vast scale of the Eastern Front in World War II, a theatre of war characterized by its unparalleled brutality and immense human cost. Now we're going to delve into the very beginning of this cataclysmic conflict, specifically the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. This was a pivotal moment, and one where the initial shock and unpreparedness of the Soviet forces led to unimaginable suffering. Today we're going to hear, as much as possible, from the voices of those who were there, the soldiers caught in the storm. The date was June 22nd, 1941. For many Soviet citizens, it began as an ordinary Sunday. Little did they know, the world was about to change forever. Along a vast front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, the German Wehrmacht, spearheaded by panzer divisions and supported by the Luftwaffe, unleashed a devastating attack. The sheer scale and ferocity of the assault caught the Soviet Red Army completely by surprise. Decades of Stalinist purges had decimated the Red Army's officer corps, leaving it weakened and demoralized. Military reforms, although underway, were far from complete. Many Soviet units were equipped with outdated weaponry, and communication networks were woefully inadequate. This, combined with Stalin's unwavering belief that Hitler would not attack so soon, created a perfect storm of vulnerability. Imagine waking to the thunder of artillery, the earth shaking beneath your feet. Imagine seeing the sky filled with enemy aircraft, dropping bombs and strafing defenseless positions. This was the reality for thousands of Soviet soldiers on that fateful morning. Let's turn to some accounts, cobbled together from surviving documents, interviews conducted later in life, and family histories. One account comes from a young tank crewman stationed near the border in Belarus. He recounts, "We were asleep in our barracks when the bombing started. It was unlike anything I had ever heard. The building shook, windows shattered, and the air filled with smoke and dust. When we finally made it outside, everything was chaos. Tanks were burning, trucks were overturned, and soldiers were running in every direction. We rushed to our T-26, but it wouldn't start. The engine just coughed and sputtered. By the time we managed to get it running, German tanks were already advancing." He goes on to describe a desperate, almost suicidal attempt to engage the enemy. "We managed to fire a few shots, but our shells just bounced off their Panzer IVs. They were much better armed and armored than we were. Our tank was quickly knocked out, and we barely escaped with our lives." This was a common story. Soviet tanks, often outnumbered and outgunned, were easy prey for the more advanced German armor. The initial days of Barbarossa saw staggering losses of Soviet tanks, aircraft, and personnel. Another account, from a signalman stationed at a communications hub near Brest-Litovsk, paints a picture of complete disarray. The phone lines were constantly being cut by the bombing, orders were coming in, but they were often contradictory or outdated. Nobody seemed to know what was happening. We were trying to relay information to the front lines, but it was like shouting into the void. Many units were simply cut off and left to fend for themselves. The breakdown in communication was a critical factor in the Soviet collapse. Commanders were unable to coordinate their forces, and units were often isolated and overwhelmed. This created pockets of resistance, but also widespread panic and demoralization. One particularly harrowing story comes from a nurse working at a field hospital near Minsk. She describes the horrific scenes she witnessed in the days following the invasion. The wounded were pouring in, wave after wave, men with terrible burns, shattered limbs, and gaping wounds. We were completely overwhelmed. We ran out of bandages, morphine, everything. We were forced to make impossible choices, deciding who had a chance of survival and who didn't. The screams of the wounded, the smell of blood and burnt flesh, it will stay with me forever. The sheer scale of the casualties inflicted by the initial German onslaught was almost incomprehensible. Field hospitals were overflowing, and many wounded soldiers were left to die on the battlefield. The lack of medical supplies and personnel only compounded the suffering. These weren't just soldiers, of course. These were fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. Their sudden disappearance left families in agony, uncertainty, and often enduring poverty. The impact on the civilian population was equally devastating. Another account recounts a group of villagers attempting to flee the advancing German forces. An elderly woman recalled, "We packed what little we could carry and started walking east. The roads were choked with refugees, all trying to escape the fighting. We saw burning villages, abandoned farms, and dead bodies along the way. The Luftwaffe was constantly strafing the roads, attacking civilians with impunity. We were terrified, hungry, and exhausted. Many people died along the way, from exhaustion, hunger, or enemy fire." The refugee crisis created by Barbarossa was immense, with millions of civilians displaced from their homes. They faced starvation, disease, and constant threat of attack. The human cost of the invasion was already staggering, and it was only just beginning. These eyewitness accounts, fragmented as they are, offer a glimpse into the chaos and horror of the opening stages of Operation Barbarossa. They speak of unpreparedness, confusion, and unimaginable suffering. They also speak of courage, resilience, and the will to survive against overwhelming odds. But the initial onslaught was a brutal lesson in the cost of complacency and the devastating consequences of being caught off guard. We'll pause here and consider the scope of these events. In our next section, we'll examine a single unit's desperate flight to survive encirclement, a tiny spotlight on the greater picture. The summer of 1941, a summer of blistering heat and unimaginable chaos. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, was in full swing, and the Wehrmacht's advance was nothing short of a blitzkrieg. Entire Red Army formations were encircled, trapped, and utterly decimated. Today we'll focus on one such encirclement, one of the most brutal of the early war, near the city of Minsk, and the almost unbelievable escape of a handful of Soviet soldiers. Imagine, if you will, the scene. Late June 1941. The Soviet 10th Army, part of the larger Western Front, was reeling, caught completely off guard by the sheer speed and ferocity of the German attack, their tanks outdated, their training inadequate, and their leadership often paralyzed. They were being pushed back relentlessly. Near Minsk, the Germans, spearheaded by Panzer Groups 2 and 3, executed a classic pincer movement, slicing through the Soviet lines like a hot knife through butter. The 10th Army found itself surrounded, a cauldron of desperate men, dwindling supplies, and constant terrifying bombardment. Escape seemed impossible, yet, amidst the chaos and despair, stories of incredible resilience and desperate gambles began to emerge. One such story centers around a unit of the 13th Rifle Division. We don't know their exact numbers, but let's picture a company, perhaps around 150 men, soldiers, mostly young, barely out of their teens, thrust into a war they were utterly unprepared for. They were led by a captain, let's call him Captain Petrov. Petrov was a veteran of the Winter War against Finland, a conflict that had exposed many of the Red Army's flaws, but also forged some truly hardened soldiers. Petrov, witnessing the collapse around him, knew that staying put meant certain death or capture. The Germans were tightening the noose. He gathered his remaining officers. A grim meeting, held in a hastily dug trench, the air thick with the smell of diesel, burnt metal, and fear. The options were laid bare: surrender, a slow death in a POW camp, or worse, a suicidal attack to break the encirclement, a valiant, but almost certainly futile, gesture. Petrov proposed another option, one that seemed almost as improbable: a desperate breakout to the east. He believed, based on patchy intelligence reports, that there might be a gap in the German lines, a weakly defended sector near the Berezina River. It was a long shot, a gamble with everything on the line, but it was their only chance. Under the cover of darkness, they began their move. The withdrawal was a delicate dance, a silent shuffle through fields of burning tanks and shattered trees. They left behind their heavy equipment, anything that would slow them down. Rifles, ammunition, and a few precious medical supplies were all they carried. The landscape was a nightmare. A patchwork of forests, swamps, and fields, all scarred by the relentless fighting. The constant shelling and strafing runs kept them pinned down during the day, forcing them to move only at night. Food was scarce. They foraged for what they could find: berries, roots, anything to stave off the gnawing hunger. Water was even harder to come by. Many drank from contaminated puddles, risking dysentery and disease. The Germans were relentless. They patrolled the roads, set up roadblocks, and used aircraft to hunt down fleeing Soviet soldiers. Several times, Petrov's unit came close to being discovered. Once they had to hide for hours in a swamp, submerged up to their necks in the murky water, while a German patrol passed just a few meters away. Another time, they stumbled upon a German supply column. A brief but brutal firefight ensued. The Soviets, outnumbered and outgunned, managed to scatter the Germans and seize some much-needed supplies, food, ammunition, and a few precious grenades. But the cost was high. Several more men were killed or wounded. As they pressed eastward, the landscape began to change. The open fields gave way to denser forests, offering some much-needed cover. They encountered other small groups of Soviet soldiers, stragglers and survivors from other units. Some joined Petrov's group, adding to their strength but also increasing their burden. Finally, after days of relentless marching, fighting and hiding, they reached the Berezina River. According to Petrov's information, there was supposed to be a bridge, but it had been destroyed by German bombing. The river was wide and fast-flowing. Crossing it would be a dangerous undertaking. They found a shallow spot, a ford that had been used by local farmers. The water was icy cold and the current was strong. They linked arms, forming a human chain, and slowly, painstakingly, began to wade across. The crossing was agonizing. The water numbed their limbs, and the current threatened to sweep them away. Several men lost their footing and were dragged downstream, disappearing into the churning water. But they pressed on, driven by the hope of survival. Finally, they reached the other side, exhausted, shivering, and depleted, but alive. They had broken free of the encirclement. They had cheated death, but their ordeal was far from over. They were still deep behind enemy lines, with hundreds of kilometers to go before they could reach friendly territory. They continued their journey eastward, scavenging, fighting, and evading the Germans at every turn. The story of Captain Petrov's unit is a testament to the resilience and determination of the Soviet soldiers on the Eastern Front. It's a story of desperate gambles, incredible courage, and the will to survive against all odds. While we may not know all their names, their story, and countless others like it, deserve to be remembered. They are the forgotten heroes of a brutal and unforgiving war. Partisan warfare begins. A village rises up against the German occupation in Belarus. The vast emerald expanse of Belarus, a land of sprawling forests, tranquil lakes, and unassuming villages. Before the war, it was a place of simple agrarian life. But in 1941, this peaceful tableau was shattered. Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, swept across Belarus with ferocious speed, leaving a trail of destruction and despair in its wake. Initially, the speed and ferocity of the German advance left the Soviet forces reeling, and many Belarusian villagers felt abandoned, utterly alone. The initial shock soon gave way to something else, something brewing beneath the surface of fear, resentment. The brutal reality of German occupation quickly extinguished any illusions of a civilized conquest. The occupiers were not liberators. They were conquerors, imposing harsh rules, requisitioning food, and meting out brutal punishments, often for the slightest infraction or for no reason at all. The systematic execution of Jews was particularly horrific, driving many to seek refuge in the forests. At first, resistance was sporadic, uncoordinated. A stolen rifle here, a sabotaged vehicle there. But as the weight of oppression grew, so too did the resolve to fight back. And in one particular village, nestled deep within the Belarusian forests, the spark of organized partisan warfare was about to ignite. Let's call this village Klenovka. It was a small community, perhaps 100 families, mostly farmers and artisans. Before the war, life in Klenovka revolved around the cycles of the seasons, the rhythms of the harvest, and the warmth of close-knit community. But the Germans changed all that. A small detachment of Wehrmacht soldiers was stationed in the village, their presence a constant reminder of the occupation. Among the villagers, a few individuals began to emerge as leaders, individuals who could channel the simmering anger and transform it into action. One such figure was a middle-aged farmer named Dmitri. Dmitri wasn't a soldier, wasn't even particularly strong, but he possessed an unwavering spirit and a deep love for his homeland. He had witnessed firsthand the horrors inflicted by the Germans, the casual cruelty, the senseless violence, and he knew that something had to be done. Another key figure was Anya, a young woman, barely out of her teens. Anya had been a school teacher before the war, full of idealism and a passion for knowledge, but the war had hardened her, forcing her to grow up quickly. She possessed a sharp intellect, a fiery determination, and a natural talent for organizing. She used her knowledge of the surrounding forests to help villagers hide, and began quietly making contact with other resistance members, some stragglers from broken Soviet units, and a few escaped prisoners of war who were hiding out in the woods. The catalyst for open rebellion came in the form of a particularly brutal incident. A young boy from the village was caught stealing a loaf of bread from the German supplies. The German commander, a particularly cruel man, ordered the boy to be publicly flogged as a warning to the other villagers. The sight of the boy's suffering was too much to bear. It broke something in the villagers, a collective dam of fear and resignation. That night, Dmitri and Anya met in secret with a small group of trusted villagers. They spoke in hushed tones, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of a single oil lamp. The mood was tense, fraught with fear and uncertainty. But beneath the fear, there was a newfound determination, a sense that they had reached a point of no return. They decided that they would no longer tolerate the German presence in their village. They would fight back. But they knew that they were outgunned and outnumbered. They needed a plan, a strategy that would allow them to strike effectively without risking the lives of the entire village. Anya suggested that they target the German supply lines. They knew that the Germans relied on a nearby road to transport supplies and reinforcements. If they could disrupt these supply lines, they could weaken the German presence in the area and give other partisan groups a chance to operate more freely. Dmitri, with his knowledge of the local terrain, knew of a particularly vulnerable section of the road, a narrow pass through the forest where an ambush could be easily set. They decided to mine the road. Using explosives salvaged from abandoned Soviet vehicles, they carefully placed mines along the pass, camouflaging them with leaves and branches. The next morning, as a German supply convoy rumbled through the forest, the mines detonated. The explosion was deafening, sending vehicles flying and scattering debris across the road. The German soldiers were caught completely by surprise. The villagers, armed with whatever weapons they could find, hunting rifles, axes, pitchforks, emerged from the forest, attacking the surviving soldiers. The fighting was fierce and chaotic. The villagers, fueled by their anger and desperation, fought with a ferocity that surprised even themselves. The Germans, caught off guard and disoriented, were quickly overwhelmed. The ambush was a success. The German supply convoy was destroyed, and the remaining soldiers were either killed or captured. The raid on the convoy was a turning point for Klonovka. It was a declaration of war. There was no going back now. The Germans would undoubtedly retaliate, and the village would be in grave danger. But the villagers were no longer afraid. They had tasted victory, and they were determined to fight for their freedom. News of the Klonovka ambush spread quickly through the surrounding area, inspiring other villages to rise up against the German occupation. The partisan movement in Belarus was gaining momentum. It was a long and bloody struggle, but the resistance of the Belarusian people played a crucial role in the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. And it all started with a small village, a few brave individuals, and an act of defiance in the face of overwhelming oppression. A story mostly forgotten now, of pure grit and bravery in the face of unbelievable cruelty. All right, let's delve into a story of extraordinary bravery, a tale that echoes through the annals of the Eastern Front, a narrative both tragic and inspiring. The story of Zoya Kosmodomyanskaya. Born in 1923, Zoya was a bright, idealistic young woman, a true believer in the communist ideals of the Soviet Union. She grew up in a time of immense social and political upheaval, a period of rapid industrialization and profound change. But her childhood wasn't without hardship. The Kosmodomyansky family faced persecution and displacement, a reality for many during the tumultuous years of collectivization. Then came Operation Barbarossa, the devastating Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Like so many young people, Zoya was swept up in a wave of patriotism and a burning desire to defend her homeland. Barely 18 years old, she volunteered for a partisan unit, a group of saboteurs tasked with operating behind enemy lines. Think about that for a moment. A teenager choosing to enter a world of immense danger, a world where the stakes were life and death, constantly. The partisan units were crucial to the Soviet war effort. They aimed to disrupt German supply lines, destroy infrastructure, and generally harass the occupying forces. The conditions were brutal. Partisans operated in small groups, often with limited supplies and facing constant threat of capture. They relied on the support of local villagers, but even that support could be tenuous, with the ever-present fear of betrayal. Zoya's unit was tasked with setting fire to villages occupied by the Germans. This was a scorched earth policy, aimed at denying the enemy shelter and resources during the harsh Russian winter. Imagine the difficult choice to potentially displace innocent civilians in order to hinder the enemy. It was a harsh measure, a desperate gamble in a desperate situation. In late November 1941, Zoya and her comrades were operating near the village of Petrishkovo, not far from Moscow. They successfully set fire to several buildings occupied by the Germans. But the Germans were on high alert. They tightened security and began actively searching for the saboteurs. Tragedy struck when Zoya was captured while attempting to set fire to a barn. She was betrayed by a local villager, a collaborator, who sought favor with the occupying forces. Think about the fear she must have felt, the sudden realization that her mission had failed, and that she was now at the mercy of the enemy. The Germans subjected Zoya to brutal interrogation and torture. They demanded information about her unit, about the location of other partisans, about any details that could help them crush the resistance movement. But Zoya remained silent. She refused to betray her comrades or reveal any secrets. She endured unimaginable pain, both physical and psychological, yet she never broke. The following day, November 29, 1941, Zoya was publicly hanged in the center of Petrishkovo. Before her execution, she reportedly addressed the villagers, urging them to continue the fight against the Germans and not to collaborate with the enemy. Her final words were a defiant cry for freedom, a testament to her unwavering courage and patriotism. Her body was left hanging for several days, a grim warning to the local population. But instead of instilling fear, her sacrifice ignited a flame of resistance. News of her bravery spread throughout the Soviet Union, transforming her into a symbol of unwavering courage and patriotic sacrifice. After the war, Zoya Kosmodomyanskaya was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest distinction in the Soviet Union. Her story became legendary, immortalized in books, films, and monuments. She became a symbol of the indomitable spirit of the Soviet people, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable adversity, courage and sacrifice could prevail. Now there have been some, over time, who've questioned the details of Zoya's story. Some historians have pointed to inconsistencies in eyewitness accounts, and others have suggested that her story was exaggerated for propaganda purposes. It's important to acknowledge these perspectives and to approach historical narratives with a critical eye. However, even if some details of the story have been embellished over time, the essence of Zoya's sacrifice remains undeniable. She was a young woman who faced unimaginable hardship and torture, yet she refused to betray her ideals or her comrades. Her bravery in the face of death inspired countless others to resist the Nazi occupation, and that legacy, that core truth of her courage, it deserves to be remembered. Zoya's story is a reminder of the immense human cost of war, the sacrifices made by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. It's a story of courage, resilience, and unwavering belief in a cause greater than oneself. And in the end, it's a story that continues to resonate with us today, reminding us of the enduring power of the human spirit, even in the darkest of times. It's a story worth remembering. The Eastern Front, a theater of war defined by its immensity, its brutality, and its unforgiving terrain. While the sweeping tank battles and fiery urban sieges capture the imagination, it's crucial to remember that much of this vast battleground was characterized by something else entirely: the oppressive, waterlogged landscape of the Pripyat marshes. Imagine, if you will, a seemingly endless expanse of swamp, bog, and slow-moving rivers, a labyrinth of reeds, mud, and stagnant pools stretching for hundreds of kilometers. This was the Pripyat marshes, a natural barrier that, ironically, became a death trap for countless soldiers on both sides of the conflict. Following the initial blitzkrieg of Operation Barbarossa in 1941, the German advance tore through Soviet defenses. Units were shattered, supply lines collapsed, and hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers found themselves cut off, lost, and desperately trying to escape encirclement. Many of these men, scattered and demoralized, sought refuge in the perceived safety of the marshes. They thought the Germans would never come looking for them there. They couldn't have been more wrong. The marshes were a harsh mistress. Survival wasn't just about evading capture, it was a constant struggle against the environment itself. The landscape presented a unique set of challenges, demanding resourcefulness, resilience, and a deep understanding of the natural world. One of the most immediate threats was the water. Clean drinking water was a precious commodity. Soldiers were often forced to drink from contaminated sources, leading to dysentery and other waterborne illnesses. The constant dampness also took its toll, causing trench foot, a debilitating condition that could render a soldier unable to walk. Imagine spending day after day, night after night, with your feet submerged in cold, fetid water. The skin would become macerated, soft and vulnerable to infection. The pain would be constant, gnawing away at your morale and your ability to function. And the longer you remained in the marshes, the worse it would get. Finding food was another monumental task. Rations were, of course, long gone for those lost behind enemy lines. Survival depended on foraging, trapping, and the willingness to eat anything that could provide sustenance. Berries, edible plants, and small animals became vital resources. Think about that for a moment. You're hungry, exhausted, and surrounded by danger. You haven't eaten a proper meal in days, and your stomach is constantly gnawing with hunger. You have to learn to identify edible plants quickly, distinguishing them from the poisonous ones that could kill you. You have to set traps for small animals, hoping that something, anything, will fall into your snare. Some accounts speak of soldiers catching frogs, snakes, and even rodents, roasting them over small fires hidden deep within the reeds. Every meal was a gamble, a trade-off between the risk of discovery and the desperate need for calories. And then there was the ever-present threat of detection. The Germans, despite the challenges of the terrain, did conduct patrols through the marshes. They used boats, amphibious vehicles, and even specially trained units to hunt down pockets of resistance and escaped prisoners of war. To avoid capture, soldiers had to become masters of camouflage and concealment. They learned to blend in with their surroundings, using mud and vegetation to disguise themselves. They moved slowly and deliberately, avoiding open areas and sticking to the thickest vegetation. They became ghosts, shadows flitting through the landscape. Building shelters was another essential survival skill. Soldiers constructed makeshift huts from reeds, branches, and mud, providing some protection from the elements and a place to rest. These shelters were often little more than damp, uncomfortable hovels, but they offered a degree of security and a much-needed respite from the constant exposure. Maintaining morale in these conditions was incredibly difficult. The constant fear, the hunger, the exhaustion, and the isolation all took a heavy toll. Many soldiers succumbed to despair, losing hope of ever escaping the marshes. But there were also stories of incredible resilience and camaraderie. Soldiers who banded together, sharing their knowledge, their resources, and their emotional support. They helped each other to survive, bolstering each other's spirits and giving each other a reason to keep fighting. These bonds, forged in the crucible of hardship, often proved to be the key to survival. One account describes a group of 5 Red Army soldiers who spent months hiding in the marshes. They were led by a sergeant, a seasoned veteran who possessed a deep knowledge of the natural world. He taught them how to find food, how to build shelters, and how to evade the enemy. He kept their spirits up with stories of home and promises of victory. Thanks to his leadership and their collective determination, all 5 men eventually managed to escape the marshes and rejoin Soviet forces. Their story is a testament to the power of human resilience and the importance of camaraderie in the face of adversity. The Pripyat marshes were more than just a physical obstacle. They were a psychological battleground, testing the limits of human endurance and forcing soldiers to confront their own mortality. Those who survived did so through a combination of skill, luck, and an unwavering will to live. Their stories, often overlooked in the grand narratives of the Eastern Front, offer a powerful reminder of the human cost of war and the extraordinary capacity of the human spirit to endure even the most unimaginable hardships. And in the quiet, still water of the marsh, perhaps the echoes of their struggles still linger, a testament to the forgotten battles fought in the heart of the swamp. The year is 1941, the Eastern Front is ablaze, and in the northwest, a city of vital strategic importance, Leningrad, finds itself in the iron grip of the German Wehrmacht. What followed was one of the most horrific sieges in human history, lasting nearly 900 days. Imagine, if you will, being trapped in a city slowly being strangled, no escape. No respite, just the constant gnawing of hunger and the ever-present threat of death raining from the skies. Our focus here is on one family, the Ivanovs, a mother, Anna, her husband, Dmitry, a factory worker, and their 2 young children, 6-year-old Boris and 8-year-old Svetlana. They lived in a small apartment in the heart of Leningrad, their lives ordinary until the world shattered around them. The initial weeks were chaotic. The relentless German advance caught the Soviet Union by surprise. News of fallen cities and retreating armies filled the airwaves. Dmitry, along with many other men, was called to join the militia, leaving Anna to care for Boris and Svetlana amidst the growing panic. Then came the encirclement. The noose tightened, supply lines were cut, food became scarce. The first signs of starvation began to appear. The bread rations, initially meager, were reduced again and again. Imagine that sinking feeling, knowing each day brings less and less sustenance. Anna, a resourceful and loving mother, did everything in her power to protect her children. She bartered what little possessions they had for scraps of food at the market. Her wedding ring, a cherished family heirloom, anything to keep her children alive, even for one more day. The bombardment was relentless. Air raid sirens wailed day and night. The earth trembled as bombs exploded nearby. They would huddle in their apartment building's basement, the cold and damp seeping into their bones, listening to the terrifying sounds of destruction above. Each explosion a potential death sentence, every siren a reminder of their precarious existence. Sleep became a luxury. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, a constant dull ache. The cold, too, was a formidable enemy. Winter descended upon Leningrad with brutal force. Fuel supplies dwindled, and the city plunged into darkness and freezing temperatures. The Ivanovs huddled together for warmth, sharing blankets and stories to distract themselves from the misery. One day, Dmitri managed to return home for a brief visit. He was gaunt and weary, his eyes filled with a haunting sadness. He brought with him a small piece of bread, a precious gift from his comrades. The joy and relief on Boris and Svetlana's faces were bittersweet for Anna, knowing how quickly that small portion would disappear. Dmitri could only stay for a few hours before returning to the front lines, leaving Anna and the children with a renewed sense of hope mixed with profound fear. As the siege dragged on, desperation grew. People began to collapse in the streets, victims of starvation and exhaustion. The once vibrant city became a ghost town, its inhabitants reduced to mere shadows of their former selves. The sounds of laughter and music were replaced by the groans of the hungry and the cries of the bereaved. Anna, witnessing the suffering around her, made a difficult decision. She knew that they couldn't survive in their apartment much longer. She decided to try and reach her sister, who lived on the outskirts of the city, near Lake Ladoga. It was a long and perilous journey, but it was their only chance. They set out early one morning, bundled in layers of clothing, their faces pale and drawn. The streets were littered with debris and the bodies of the dead. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and decay. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare. The journey was arduous. They walked for hours, their strength waning with each step. Boris and Svetlana stumbled frequently, their little legs struggling to keep up. Anna carried them when she could, her own body aching with fatigue and hunger. Along the way, they encountered other survivors, all desperate to escape the city's clutches. Some were helpful, offering what little food or water they had. Others were consumed by their own survival, indifferent to the plight of others. They finally reached Anna's sister's house, a small, dilapidated cottage on the edge of the lake. Her sister, Olga, was overjoyed to see them, but her situation was hardly better. She too was struggling to survive, but she welcomed them with open arms, sharing her meager rations. Life near Lake Ladoga was still difficult, but it offered a glimmer of hope. The lake, when frozen, became the road of life, a treacherous ice road used to transport supplies into the city and evacuate the starving. Anna and Olga worked tirelessly, helping to unload trucks and care for the wounded, clinging to the hope that one day the siege would be lifted and life would return to normal. The siege of Leningrad was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The Ivanovs, like countless other families, endured unimaginable hardship and loss. Their story is a reminder of the horrors of war and the importance of compassion and hope in the face of adversity. It's a story of how a mother's love can become an unending source of strength against the greatest odds. The story of a family refusing to surrender to the darkness closing in around them. Imagine, if you will, a city on the brink, a once proud metropolis, now starving, freezing, and under constant bombardment. That was Leningrad in the winter of 1941. The German siege had choked off all land routes, trapping millions within its icy grip. But there was a sliver of hope, a fragile lifeline across the frozen expanse of Lake Ladoga. It became known as the Road of Life, and its story is one of unimaginable resilience and sacrifice. Lake Ladoga, Even its name sounds cold. It's the largest lake entirely within Europe, a vast, often tempestuous body of water. In summer, it's a formidable challenge for ships, but in winter, it transforms into something even more treacherous, a seemingly endless expanse of ice. And it was across this ice that the people of Leningrad were forced to place their hopes. The initial attempts to supply the city were, well, they were desperate. Small convoys of trucks, often barely functioning, began to tentatively cross the ice in late November 1941. The ice was thin, unpredictable, and constantly under attack from German artillery and aircraft. These early journeys were fraught with peril. Trucks would plunge through the ice, swallowed whole by the frigid depths. Drivers often faced the agonizing choice: abandon their precious cargo of flour and supplies or go down with their vehicle. Imagine the scene: the sun, a pale disk barely visible through the perpetual winter gloom, casts long skeletal shadows across the frozen lake. The wind howls, whipping snow into stinging flurries that obscure everything. The air temperature, well, it's hard to truly comprehend the cold. We're talking temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. And the only thing separating you from a watery grave is a thin layer of ice that might crack at any moment. These weren't seasoned soldiers, mind you. Many of the drivers were civilians, hastily trained and thrown into this incredibly dangerous task. They were ordinary people, farmers, factory workers, anyone who could hold a steering wheel. They were driven by a desperate desire to save their families, their city, their way of life. And then there were the attack. German artillery would relentlessly shell the road of life, turning the ice into a deadly minefield of craters and shattered vehicles. Enemy aircraft would strafe the convoys, forcing drivers to abandon their trucks and seek cover in the icy wasteland. Many didn't make it. The conditions were so extreme that mechanical failures were commonplace. Trucks would break down in the middle of the lake, leaving their drivers stranded in the freezing cold with little chance of rescue. To repair a vehicle meant wrestling with frozen metal, with bare hands, often while under fire. It was a test of endurance that pushed people to their absolute limits. But the road of life wasn't just about transporting supplies into Leningrad. It was also about evacuating the sick, the wounded, and the most vulnerable. Imagine being crammed into the back of a truck, already weakened by starvation and disease, bouncing across the frozen lake under constant threat of attack. The journey itself could be fatal. Despite the horrors, the road of life persevered. As winter deepened, the ice thickened, allowing for larger convoys and more frequent trips. The Soviets worked tirelessly to maintain the route, repairing damaged sections, clearing debris, and providing what little support they could to the drivers. They even built ice roads with multiple lanes to increase the flow of traffic. The road of life became a symbol of hope, a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even the most unimaginable suffering. It wasn't a perfect solution, not by any means. The supplies were still meager, and the journey remained incredibly dangerous. But it was enough to keep Leningrad alive, to prevent the city from succumbing to starvation and collapse. Think about the courage it took. The drivers, the mechanics, the support staff. They all knew the risks. They saw the frozen corpses of those who had come before them. They felt the rumble of artillery fire and the chilling spray of icy water as trucks plunged through the ice. But they kept going, they kept driving, they kept fighting to keep Leningrad alive. And it wasn't just about food and supplies. The road of life also became a conduit for communication, for news from the outside world, letters, photographs, even small packages from loved ones. These small gestures of connection meant everything to the besieged citizens of Leningrad. The road of life wasn't just a road, it was a lifeline. It was a symbol of resistance. It was a testament to the enduring power of hope in the face of unimaginable despair. It was a harrowing journey across a frozen lake, but it was also a journey into the depths of the human spirit, and it's a journey we must never forget, because within its icy depths lie the stories of countless heroes, both known and unknown, who risked everything to save a city and its people. And that in itself is a story worth remembering. The Eastern Front, a theater of war defined by its immensity, its brutality, and its relentless human cost. Amidst the earth-shattering explosions, the deafening roar of artillery, and the silent screams of the dying, there existed another tragedy, one often overshadowed by the grand narratives of armies and ideologies: the plight of the children. Our focus shifts now to the heartbreaking stories of the countless youngsters who found themselves orphaned, abandoned, or simply lost in the chaos, forced to navigate a world stripped of its innocence. Imagine, if you will, a scene repeated countless times across the vast expanse of occupied territory. A farmhouse, once filled with laughter and the warmth of family, now lies in smoldering ruins, the victims of a stray shell or a brutal reprisal. The parents, gone. The older siblings, perhaps conscripted into the army or spirited away to join the partisans. And left behind, clinging to life amidst the rubble, are the youngest, too small to fight, too vulnerable to comprehend the enormity of the disaster that has befallen them. These children, the children of the Eastern Front, were forced to grow up in an instant. The carefree days of childhood, of games and stories, and the comfort of a mother's embrace were brutally snatched away, replaced by a desperate fight for survival. They became masters of scavenging, experts in hiding, their tiny bodies fueled by a primal instinct to live. Many found themselves wandering aimlessly, joining the ever-growing ranks of the displaced. They drifted from village to village, their faces etched with fear and hunger, begging for scraps of food, a place to sleep for the night, a flicker of human kindness in a world consumed by darkness. The luckier ones might stumble upon a sympathetic farmer, a compassionate villager, willing to share their meager rations, to offer a temporary haven from the storm. But resources were scarce, and suspicion ran high. The constant threat of betrayal, of denunciation, of being discovered by the occupying forces, hung heavy in the air. Others sought refuge in the forests, vast and unforgiving, but offering a degree of anonymity and protection. Here, they learned to live off the land, foraging for berries and mushrooms, trapping small animals, becoming, in essence, miniature survivalists. They banded together, forming makeshift families, relying on each other for warmth, for companionship, for a shared sense of hope, however fragile. The older children took on the role of caregivers, protecting the younger ones, sharing their meager resources, and teaching them the skills they needed to survive. These forest children, as they became known, lived a precarious existence, constantly on the move, evading patrols, avoiding the dangers of wild animals, and the even greater threat of human predators. They were hunted not only by the enemy, but also by desperate individuals, driven to extreme measures by hunger and fear. Stories abound of children being exploited, forced into servitude, or worse, simply abandoned to their fate. Yet, amidst the horror, there were also incredible acts of resilience, of courage, of unwavering human spirit. We hear of children who acted as couriers for the partisans, risking their lives to deliver messages, to scout enemy positions, their small size and unassuming appearance allowing them to slip past watchful eyes. Others helped to sabotage enemy equipment, using their ingenuity and resourcefulness to disrupt the German war machine. One story, particularly poignant, tells of a young girl named Anya who lost her entire family in a bombing raid. Anya, barely 8 years old, found herself alone in the ruins of her village. Driven by a fierce determination to survive, she attached herself to a group of partisans, offering to help in any way she could. She became their water carrier, their cook, their errand girl, her small hands tirelessly performing tasks beyond her years. but it was her ability to speak fluent German, learned from her grandmother, that proved to be her greatest asset. Disguised as a beggar, she would loiter near German garrisons, eavesdropping on conversations, gathering valuable intelligence that she would then relay to the partisans. Anya became their eyes and ears, a vital source of information that helped them to plan ambushes, to disrupt supply lines, to inflict heavy casualties on the enemy. Another story speaks of a group of orphaned boys, led by a resourceful teenager named Boris, who formed a gang of scavengers in the ruins of Stalingrad. They risked their lives daily, venturing into the bombed-out buildings, searching for food, for weapons, for anything that could help them survive. They developed an uncanny ability to navigate the labyrinthine streets, to anticipate danger, to outwit the German soldiers who patrolled the area. Boris, wise beyond his years, instilled in his young followers a sense of discipline, of loyalty, of unwavering commitment to each other. They shared their meager resources, protected each other from harm, and looked out for the vulnerable. They were a family, forged in the fires of war, their bonds strengthened by shared hardship and a common will to survive. These children, the children of the Eastern Front, were the forgotten victims of a brutal and unforgiving war. Their stories, often lost in the grand narratives of battles and ideologies, serve as a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict, of the devastating impact on the most vulnerable members of society. They are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the power of hope in the face of despair, and to the enduring bonds of family, even in the most extreme circumstances. Their survival is a miracle in itself, and their stories deserve to be told, to be remembered, and to serve as a warning against the horrors of war for generations to come. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, the flame of humanity can still flicker, fueled by the courage, the resilience, and the unwavering hope of the children. Welcome back, friends. Tonight, we turn our attention to a figure who shattered expectations and left an indelible mark on the Eastern Front, Lyudmila Pavlyuchenko. Her story is one of extraordinary courage, unwavering dedication, and a level of skill that turned her into a legend, a deadly legend, that is. In a time when societal norms often confined women to roles away from the front lines, Lyudmila Pavlyuchenko stepped forward, not to offer comfort or care, but to fight. She was born in a small village in Ukraine, and from a young age, she displayed a fierce determination and a keen interest in marksmanship. Little did anyone know then just how proficient she would become. Before the war, Lyudmila was a history student at Kyiv University. Life was normal. She enjoyed her studies, she participated in shooting clubs, and she dreamt of the future. But the thunderous arrival of Operation Barbarossa in 1941 changed everything, didn't it? Like so many others, Lyudmila felt compelled to defend her homeland, her people, her way of life. And unlike many others, she knew exactly how she wanted to do it. She didn't want to be a nurse, or a cook, or a signals operator. No, Lyudmila Pavlyuchenko wanted to be a sniper. This wasn't a common path for women at the time. In fact, many recruiting officers tried to steer her towards more suitable roles. But Lyudmila was persistent, resolute even. She'd completed a sniper training course before the war. She had the skills, she had the will, and she wasn't going to take no for an answer. Eventually, she was accepted into the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division, one of approximately 2,000 female snipers who would serve in the Soviet military during the war. And so began her transformation from history student to something far more. Her first taste of combat came during the brutal fighting in Moldavia. It was here, amidst the chaos and carnage of the Eastern Front, that Lyudmila began to hone her skills, to learn the subtle art of camouflage, patience, and deadly precision. She quickly proved her worth, racking up confirmed kills with impressive speed. Each shot, each fallen enemy, was a testament to her skill and her unwavering resolve. The Eastern Front was a theater of unimaginable brutality, and snipers played a particularly grim role. They were masters of concealment, spending hours, sometimes days, lying motionless in wait for their targets. It was a game of patience, a test of nerves, and a brutal exercise in dehumanization. But for Ludmila, it was also a matter of survival, of defending her country against a ruthless invader. She fought in the defense of Odessa and then in the harrowing siege of Sevastopol. These were some of the most intense and desperate battles of the entire war. Imagine the constant artillery fire, the relentless air raids, the desperate hand-to-hand combat. It was in this hellish environment that Ludmila Pavlyuchenko truly earned her reputation as a deadly sniper. She wasn't just good, she was exceptional. She possessed an uncanny ability to anticipate enemy movements, to blend seamlessly into the environment, and to make every shot count. Her kill count climbed steadily, earning her the respect and fear of both her comrades and her enemies. She was credited with 309 confirmed kills, making her the most successful female sniper in recorded history. Let that number sink in for a moment. 309 lives ended by her hand. It's a staggering, almost incomprehensible figure. But Ludmila was more than just a statistic. She became a symbol of Soviet resistance, a figure of inspiration for women and men alike. She was proof that courage and skill knew no gender. In 1942, after being wounded in battle, she was withdrawn from the front lines and sent on a propaganda tour to the United States, Canada, and Great Britain. She used her platform to rally support for the Soviet war effort, sharing her experiences and appealing to the world for help in defeating Nazi Germany. Imagine this young woman, barely out of her 20s, standing before crowds of Americans and Canadians, speaking passionately about the horrors of war and the desperate need for assistance. She met with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, forging a strong bond with the latter. Eleanor even invited Ludmila to stay at the White House. Her message resonated deeply with the American public, helping to sway public opinion in favor of increased aid to the Soviet Union. She was a powerful voice, a living testament to the sacrifices being made on the Eastern Front. When asked by reporters about her kill count, Ludmila reportedly responded with a simple yet chilling statement: "I have killed 309 fascists." There was no boasting, no bravado, just a cold, hard statement of fact. It was a stark reminder of the brutal reality of war and the toll it took on those who fought it. After her propaganda tour, Ludmila returned to the Soviet Union and became an instructor, training other snipers for combat. She never returned to the front lines herself, but her legacy continued to inspire generations of Soviet soldiers. Ludmila Pavlyuchenko's story is a complex and fascinating one. She was a woman thrust into extraordinary circumstances, who rose to the challenge with unwavering courage and skill. She was a deadly sniper, a symbol of resistance, and a powerful voice for her country. But beneath the surface of the legendary figure, there was also a human being, a young woman who experienced the horrors of war firsthand. The psychological toll of her experiences must have been immense. We can only imagine the nightmares that haunted her, the memories that she carried with her long after the war was over. Her story is a reminder that war is never glorious, never clean, and never without its cost. It's a reminder of the courage and sacrifice of those who fought on the Eastern Front, and a reminder of the enduring human spirit that can triumph even in the face of unimaginable adversity. And as we drift off to sleep tonight, let us remember Ludmila Pavlyuchenko, the deadly sniper, and all those who fought and sacrificed during those terrible years. May their stories never be forgotten. The Eastern Front, a meat grinder of nations, a canvas painted with blood and snow. We often think of it as a monolithic clash between two unwavering ideologies, Nazi Germany and Soviet communism. But the reality, as always, was far more complex. Within the seemingly impenetrable ranks of the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, existed pockets of resistance, individuals who, despite the immense personal risk, chose to defy Hitler's regime. These were the German defectors and anti-Nazi resistors, and their stories, often overshadowed by the sheer scale of the conflict, are tales of remarkable courage and moral conviction. Now, it's important to understand that outright. Organized resistance within the Wehrmacht was exceedingly rare. The Nazi regime was built on fear and absolute obedience. Dissent was met with swift and brutal punishment, not just for the individual, but often for their families as well. The Gestapo, the Nazi secret police, had a long reach, even into the ranks of the military. But even in this climate of terror, cracks appeared in the facade of unity. The motivations for resistance were varied. For some, it was disgust at the atrocities they witnessed firsthand, the mass shootings of civilians, the systematic starvation of prisoners of war, the barbarity of the SS Einsatzgruppen. Soldiers from diverse backgrounds, some with pre-existing political leanings against the Nazi Party, found their revulsion growing with each passing act of inhumanity. They couldn't reconcile what they were seeing with any sense of decency or humanity. Others were driven by a dawning realization that the war was unwinnable, that Hitler's ambitions were leading Germany towards utter destruction. These were often officers, men with a better understanding of the strategic situation, who saw the unsustainable losses and the dwindling resources. They realized the propaganda they had been fed was a lie, and they despaired for the future of their country. And then there were those motivated by a deep-seated sense of morality, a refusal to participate in what they saw as an unjust and evil war. These individuals may not have been overtly political, but their conscience simply wouldn't allow them to continue serving a regime that was responsible for such immense suffering. So, how did these resistors manifest their defiance? Overt acts of rebellion were almost suicidal. More common were acts of sabotage, small acts of defiance that, while seemingly insignificant, could have a cumulative effect. Soldiers might deliberately damage equipment, delay orders, or provide inaccurate information. Some even went so far as to warn civilians of impending raids or massacres, risking their own lives to save others. One particularly courageous act was desertion, crossing over to the Soviet side. This was an incredibly dangerous undertaking. Not only did deserters face the risk of being shot by their own comrades if caught, but they also faced an uncertain welcome from the Soviets. The Soviets were understandably suspicious of German soldiers, and many deserters were initially treated as spies or provocateurs. However, some defectors were able to prove their sincerity and were eventually integrated into Soviet units or used for propaganda purposes. One notable example is the story of Lieutenant Colonel Helmuth James Graf von Moltke, a lawyer and a descendant of a famous Prussian military family. Moltke wasn't a soldier on the Eastern Front, but he was a key figure in the Kreisau Circle, a group of dissidents within the German elite who secretly planned for a post-Nazi Germany. While not directly involved in military resistance, his moral opposition to the Nazi regime and his efforts to establish a just and peaceful future made him a significant figure in the broader anti-Nazi movement. He was eventually arrested and executed for his beliefs. Another example, albeit a less well-known one, is the story of a Wehrmacht soldier named Paul Roche. Roche, deeply disturbed by the atrocities he witnessed in occupied Ukraine, eventually deserted to the Soviet side. He was initially met with suspicion, but he managed to convince the Soviets of his genuine desire to fight against the Nazis. He became a valuable source of intelligence, providing information about German troop movements and fortifications. He even participated in propaganda campaigns, broadcasting appeals to other German soldiers to defect. These stories, while inspiring, were tragically rare. The vast majority of Wehrmacht soldiers remained loyal to the Nazi regime, either out of genuine belief, fear of reprisal, or a combination of both. However, the existence of these German defectors and anti-Nazi resistors serves as a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, there are always individuals who are willing to stand up for what is right, even at great personal cost. Their actions, however small, challenged the narrative of a unified and invincible Wehrmacht. They demonstrated that even within the ranks of the enemy, there were those who recognized the evil of the Nazi regime and were willing to risk everything to oppose it. Their stories are a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and the importance of moral courage in the face of overwhelming adversity. They remind us that even in the midst of the most brutal and dehumanizing conflict, the flame of humanity can still flicker, offering a glimmer of hope amidst the darkness. The Battle of Stalingrad. Even the name itself carries a weight, a resonance of unimaginable suffering and relentless, brutal combat. For many, it marks the turning point of the Second World War, the moment the seemingly unstoppable German advance finally faltered and cracked. But beyond the strategic importance, beyond the sweeping maps and grand strategies, lies the grim reality for the soldiers who fought and died in its ruined streets. Today we delve into that reality, through the eyes, and hopefully, with some of their remembered words, of those who were there. Imagine, if you can, a city once vibrant, teeming with life, now reduced to a smoldering wasteland. Buildings stand as hollowed-out skeletons, their facades scarred by artillery fire, their interiors choked with rubble and the lingering scent of death. That was Stalingrad in the autumn of 1942. The German Luftwaffe had systematically pulverized the city, turning it into a graveyard before their troops even set foot inside. The initial German advance was swift and merciless. Waves of soldiers, supported by tanks and aircraft, pushed deep into the city, encountering fierce resistance from the defending Soviet forces. The fighting quickly devolved into a chaotic, close-quarters struggle. Every street, every building, every room became a potential battlefield. Snipers lurked in the ruins, patiently waiting for their prey. Machine gun nests spat out deadly fire from shattered windows. Hand grenades exploded in cramped hallways, turning corridors into killing zones. One Red Army soldier, a young conscript named Dmitry, later recalled, "It wasn't war as I understood it. It was something else, a nightmare. We were fighting for every inch of ground, every brick, every pile of rubble. You couldn't see the enemy, but they were always there, just around the corner, behind a wall, waiting to kill you." The days and nights blurred together. Sleep was a luxury we could barely afford, and when we did sleep, we were haunted by the faces of the dead. Dmitry's experience was far from unique. Stalingrad was a meat grinder. The life expectancy of a soldier on the front lines was measured in days, sometimes even hours. The fighting was so intense that entire units were wiped out in a single afternoon. Replacements arrived, often young and inexperienced, only to be thrown into the same deadly furnace. The urban environment amplified the brutality of the conflict. Tanks were rendered largely ineffective in the narrow streets, becoming easy targets for infantry, armed with Molotov cocktails and anti-tank rifles. Soldiers had to rely on their wits and courage to survive. They learned to navigate the ruins, to use the rubble as cover, to anticipate the enemy's movements. Another soldier, a veteran sergeant named Anna, who served as a medic, described the horrors she witnessed. "The worst part wasn't the fighting, although that was terrifying enough. It was the wounded. So many wounded, so many broken bodies, so much pain. We didn't have enough medical supplies, not enough doctors, not enough time. We did what we could, but so many died in our arms, begging for water, for their mothers, for it all to end." The Battle of Stalingrad was also a battle of attrition. The Germans, despite their initial successes, found themselves bogged down in the city. The Soviets, despite suffering heavy losses, refused to yield. They reinforced their positions, launched counterattacks, and kept the Germans constantly on the defensive. The Soviets also implemented a strategy known as hugging the enemy. They positioned their troops as close to the German lines as possible, making it difficult for the Luftwaffe to bomb them without also hitting their own forces. This tactic further intensified the close-quarters fighting and made the battle even more chaotic and unpredictable. As the weeks turned into months, the situation inside Stalingrad deteriorated rapidly. Food and water became scarce. The winter set in, bringing with it freezing temperatures and blizzards. Soldiers on both sides suffered from frostbite, starvation, and disease. The dead lay where they fell, their bodies frozen solid, a grim testament to the ferocity of the fighting. One German soldier, a private named Hans, wrote in his diary, "This is not war, this is hell. We are surrounded by death." The Russians fight like demons. They never give up. We are running out of supplies. We are freezing. We are starving. I don't think I will ever leave this place alive. Hans's words reflect the growing despair that gripped the German forces as the battle dragged on. The Soviets, meanwhile, were bolstered by reinforcements and renewed determination. They knew that the fate of their country, perhaps even the world, rested on their shoulders. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a massive counter-offensive, codenamed Operation Uranus. They struck at the flanks of the German Sixth Army, which was spearheading the assault on Stalingrad, encircling the entire army in a vast pocket. The German Sixth Army, cut off from supplies and reinforcements, was doomed. Hitler, however, refused to allow them to retreat. He ordered them to fight the last man, promising that they would be resupplied by air. But the Luftwaffe was unable to deliver sufficient supplies, and the German soldiers slowly starved and froze to death. The final weeks of the Battle of Stalingrad were a living hell. The German soldiers, weakened by starvation and disease, fought on with dwindling ammunition and little hope. The Soviets relentlessly tightened the noose around them, pushing them back into ever smaller pockets of resistance. On February 2, 1943, the last German troops in Stalingrad surrendered. The battle had lasted for over 5 months and had claimed the lives of an estimated 2 million people, soldiers and civilians alike. It was one of the bloodiest battles in human history. The Battle of Stalingrad was a turning point, not just on the Eastern Front, but in the entire Second World War. It demonstrated the resilience and determination of the Soviet people and shattered the myth of German invincibility. It was a victory bought at an immense cost, a victory forged in the fires of unimaginable suffering. But from those ashes, a new hope arose, a hope that one day the war would finally be over. The year is 1942. The relentless German advance has chewed deep into the Soviet Union. For many, escape seems an impossible dream. But today, we're going to tell the story of Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov, a pilot whose story embodies the resilience of the human spirit against overwhelming odds. Dmitry was a seasoned pilot, a veteran of countless dogfights above the sprawling battlefields of the Eastern Front. He flew a sturdy, if somewhat outdated, Polikarpov I-16, nicknamed Ishak, or Little Donkey, by its pilots. It wasn't the fastest or the most heavily armed aircraft, but it was maneuverable, and Dmitry knew its every quirk. He'd become intimately acquainted with its every vibration, its every sputter, its every protesting groan under stress. One fateful morning, while escorting a flight of Il-2 ground attack aircraft, Dmitry's luck ran out. A sudden barrage of flak tore through his wing, sending the little donkey into a spiraling descent. He fought desperately to regain control, but it was no use. The controls were unresponsive, the aircraft bucking and shuddering violently. Dmitry knew he had only seconds. Bracing himself, he pulled the ejection lever. The force of the blast threw him clear of the stricken aircraft, and his parachute blossomed open just as the I-16 slammed into the unforgiving earth below. He floated down, the roar of the battle fading as he descended. But the respite was short-lived. As he neared the ground, he realized he was directly over enemy territory. The landscape below was a patchwork of fields and forests, dotted with the telltale signs of German occupation, camouflaged vehicles, newly erected checkpoints, and the grim, watchful eyes of enemy soldiers. Landing hard, Dmitry quickly detached himself from his parachute, burying it hastily in a nearby thicket. He knew he had to move, and fast. He was deep behind enemy lines, with no hope of immediate rescue. His survival now depended entirely on his wits, his courage, and a healthy dose of luck. Dmitry was alone, unarmed except for his service pistol, and surrounded by the enemy. He had no map, no compass, and no food. His only goal to somehow make his way back to Soviet lines. His training kicked in. Dmitry navigated by the sun and stars, moving primarily at night to avoid detection. He traversed dense forests and treacherous swamps, constantly aware of the dangers lurking around every corner. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent his heart racing. He scavenged for food, subsisting on berries, mushrooms, and whatever else he could find. The gnawing hunger was a constant companion, but he knew he couldn't afford to be careless. He had to remain alert, focused, and above all, alive. One evening, while attempting to cross a small stream, Dmitri stumbled upon a hidden farm. The farm appeared deserted, but smoke rising from the chimney suggested otherwise. Cautiously, he approached the farmhouse, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. He peered through a crack in the wooden shutters. Inside, he saw a group of elderly peasants huddled around a table, their faces etched with worry. He recognized the traditional Russian clothing they wore. These were his people. Taking a deep breath, Dmitri knocked softly on the door. An old woman answered, her eyes widening in surprise and fear. He quickly identified himself as a Soviet pilot and pleaded for their help. After a moment of hesitation, the woman ushered him inside. The peasants listened intently as Dmitri recounted his story, their faces a mixture of sympathy and concern. They knew the risks they were taking by harboring him, but they couldn't turn their backs on a fellow countryman in need. The peasants provided Dmitri with food, water, and a place to rest. They also gave him civilian clothing, disguising him as a simple farmer. They knew the surrounding area well, and they told him about the German patrols, the checkpoints, and the safest routes to take. However, their generosity came with a warning. A local collaborator, a man named Petrov, was known to be actively working with the Germans, informing on anyone suspected of supporting the partisans or aiding escaped Soviet soldiers. Dmitri would have to be extra careful. For several days, Dmitri remained hidden at the farm, regaining his strength and planning his next move. He learned that the nearest Soviet lines were several days' march to the east, but the route was fraught with danger. He decided to leave under the cover of darkness. The peasants gave him a loaf of bread, a small knife, and a prayer for his safe return. Dmitri thanked them profusely, knowing that he owed them his life. His journey eastward was even more perilous than before. He had to avoid German patrols, navigate through treacherous terrain, and evade the watchful eyes of Petrov's collaborators. He relied on his instincts, his training, and the occasional kindness of strangers. One night, he encountered a group of partisans operating in the forest. Initially suspicious, they interrogated him thoroughly before accepting him into their ranks. The partisans were a ragtag group of local villagers and escaped soldiers, united by their hatred of the German occupiers. They provided Dmitri with a weapon, shared their meager rations, and taught him the secrets of guerrilla warfare. He fought alongside them, sabotaging German supply lines, ambushing patrols, and gathering intelligence. Weeks turned into months. Dmitri became an integral part of the partisan unit, his piloting skills proving invaluable in scouting enemy positions and coordinating attacks. He was no longer just a pilot, he was a freedom fighter, a symbol of resistance against the Nazi invaders. Finally, after months of hardship and sacrifice, the Soviet counteroffensive began. The tide of the war was turning. Dmitri and the partisans played a crucial role in liberating their region from German control. As the Red Army advanced, Dmitri finally reached Soviet lines, a gaunt and weary figure, but his spirit unbroken. He was greeted as a hero, a testament to the indomitable will of the Soviet people. Dmitri Volkov's story is just one of many tales of courage and survival from the Eastern Front. It's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure, that hope can persist, and that even the most desperate circumstances can be overcome with courage, resilience, and a little bit of help from others. And that sometimes the smallest act of kindness, a loaf of bread, a hidden shelter, can make all the difference between life and death. Sleep well. Imagine for a moment that the line between right and wrong blurs, not in some abstract philosophical debate, but in the desperate struggle to simply exist. This is what faced millions of ordinary people in the occupied territories of the Eastern Front. As the Wehrmacht swept eastward, they left behind a patchwork of control, a system ripe for both heroic resistance and heartbreaking compromise. Today, we delve into the uncomfortable truths of collaboration and betrayal, exploring the moral ambiguity that haunted so many during those brutal years. It's easy to condemn those who aided the enemy. We see images of collaborators, often in grainy black and white, and we automatically recoil, but consider the situation from their perspective. Imagine your village, your home, your life, under the iron fist of a foreign power. Imagine the daily fear, the constant hunger, the ever-present threat of violence, not just to you but to your family. In this environment, survival becomes paramount, and survival often demanded choices that under normal circumstances would be unthinkable. Collaboration wasn't always about embracing Nazi ideology. More often it was about pragmatism, about seizing a fleeting opportunity to alleviate suffering. A village elder might agree to provide food and lodging to German soldiers in exchange for a promise of safety for his community. A farmer might accept employment on a German-controlled farm, not out of loyalty to the Reich, but to feed his starving children. These weren't necessarily acts of treason, but desperate calculations made under unimaginable pressure. Of course, there were those whose collaboration went far beyond mere survival. There were individuals who actively embraced the Nazi regime, driven by personal gain, political opportunism, or even pre-existing prejudices. Local police forces, often recruited from the occupied population, became instruments of terror, enforcing German edicts, hunting down partisans, and participating in the persecution of Jews and other minorities. These were the individuals who actively sought to profit from the misery of others, and their actions cast a long shadow over the post-war landscape. The lines, as you can see, were incredibly blurry. Take the case of interpreters. On the surface, it might seem like a relatively harmless occupation. Someone needed to translate between the German administration and the local population, but an interpreter could wield immense power. They could manipulate information, amplify or diminish the severity of German demands, and even influence the fate of individuals. A corrupt interpreter could use their position to settle personal scores, denounce rivals, or even betray those who resisted. Conversely, a courageous interpreter could subtly sabotage German efforts, provide warnings to the underground, and even save lives. Their true allegiances often remained hidden, masked by the necessities of their role. Then there's the question of betrayal within families and communities. The pressure cooker environment of occupation bred suspicion and paranoia. Neighbors turned against neighbors, motivated by envy, resentment, or simply the fear of being denounced themselves. Family members might betray each other for a scrap of food, a better job, or simply to protect themselves from the consequences of another's actions. These acts of betrayal, born of desperation and fear, left deep scars that lasted long after the war ended. The partisan movement, while a vital force of resistance, also contributed to the moral complexities of the situation. Partisans, often operating in small, isolated units, relied on the support of the local population for food, shelter, and information. This support wasn't always freely given. Sometimes it was coerced, sometimes it was offered willingly out of genuine patriotism, and sometimes it was a carefully calculated gamble. Villages that aided the partisans risked brutal reprisals from the Germans, including mass executions and the destruction of entire communities. This created a terrible dilemma for many civilians: support the resistance and risk annihilation, or collaborate with the occupiers and face the condemnation of their countrymen. The post-war reckoning was often swift and unforgiving. Individuals accused of collaboration faced trials, imprisonment, and even execution, but the process was often flawed, driven by vengeance, and fueled by incomplete information. Many innocent people were caught in the crossfire, victims of false accusations or political expediency. The quest for justice often became a witch hunt, further dividing communities and perpetuating the cycle of violence. It's important to remember that the vast majority of people caught in the occupied territories were not heroes or villains, but ordinary individuals struggling to survive in extraordinary circumstances. They were forced to make impossible choices, choices that often defied easy categorization. Their actions were shaped by fear, hunger, and the overwhelming desire to protect themselves and their loved ones. Understanding the moral ambiguity of collaboration and betrayal is not about condoning wrongdoing. It's about acknowledging the complexity of human behavior under extreme duress. It's about recognizing that even in the darkest of times, people are capable of both great cruelty and remarkable resilience. And it's about remembering the victims of this brutal conflict, both those who suffered at the hands of the occupiers and those who were caught in the crossfire of a war that blurred the lines between right and wrong beyond recognition. The stories remind us that war isn't just about battles and strategies, but about the human cost, the shattered lives, and the enduring scars that remain long after the fighting stops. These are not comfortable stories, but they are essential for understanding the true nature of the Eastern Front and the legacy it left behind. All right, let's talk about some serious courage, shall we? Picture this: the vast, unforgiving Eastern Front, a brutal, almost exclusively male domain. And then emerging from the darkness comes the Night Witches. Now that's a name, isn't it? Almost sounds like something out of a fairy tale, a slightly terrifying one. But trust me, the reality behind the legend is even more impressive. These weren't mythical figures, but real flesh and blood Soviet women, young women, many still in their teens or early 20s, who formed the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. Later, they would be called the 46th Taman Guards Night Bomber Aviation Regiment, the only all-female unit in the Soviet Air Force, and quite possibly the world during World War II. Think about that for a second. A unit staffed entirely by women in one of the most savage and unforgiving theaters of war history had ever known. It's remarkable, really. Now, how did this happen? Well, in 1941, Marina Raskova, a famous Soviet aviator, think of her as the Amelia Earhart of the Soviet Union, used her connections with Stalin to convince him to allow women to form their own combat units. Stalin, perhaps surprisingly, agreed. He saw the potential, maybe even the propaganda value, in showcasing Soviet women's strength and patriotism. This was a war where every able body counted, and Stalin was always very keen on PR, so he may have seen them as good press, or perhaps he realized their potential to be great soldiers. So Raskova set about recruiting, and she found a flood of eager volunteers, teachers, students, factory workers, all wanting to defend their homeland. They were young, idealistic, and fiercely determined. This isn't a war of the old and the seasoned. These are the fresh-faced youths ready to defend their home. Now here's where things get interesting. These women weren't given the latest, most advanced technology. Oh no, they were given Polikarpov Pol-2 biplanes, simple, open cockpit aircraft that were already pretty outdated by the time the war started. Think of them like flying tractors or crop dusters, slow, noisy, and incredibly vulnerable. And yet, these were their weapons. These little planes were primarily used as training aircraft before the war, and were never really intended for combat. They were made of plywood and canvas. The biplanes were so basic, they didn't even have parachutes on some missions to make it lighter. It's quite the sacrifice. They also lacked radios or radar. It's easy to see why so many thought they were useless in modern combat, but that's where the Night Witches turned their limitations into a lethal advantage. See, their strategy was based on stealth and surprise. They would fly their rickety Pol-2s under the cover of darkness, cutting their engines near the target and gliding silently toward it. The only sound was the wind whistling through the biplane's wings, which some German soldiers likened to the sound of a witch's broom, hence the name, Narthexen in German, which translates to night witches. The name was both terrifying and in a way strangely respectful. It spoke to the fear and mystique these women inspired. Can you imagine the scene? It's pitch black. You're a German soldier, weary and tense. Suddenly you hear this faint whoosh sound. You look up, but you see nothing. Then, boom, bombs start raining down, and you realize with a chilling certainty that you're being attacked by witches. The psychological impact must have been enormous. Their missions were incredibly dangerous. The night witches flew multiple sorties each night, sometimes as many as 15 or 18 in a single shift. They faced constant anti-aircraft fire, the threat of being shot down by enemy fighters, and the bone-chilling cold of flying in open cockpits at night. The plywood structure of the plane made them easily flammable. Imagine how exposed and vulnerable they must have felt. And the missions weren't easy. They carried 2 bombs at a time, weighing around 50 to 100 kilograms each. After dropping them, they had to return to base to pick up more, usually having to complete several sorties per night. Each flight was a gamble, but they persevered. They were accurate, relentless, and absolutely fearless. They disrupted enemy supply lines, harassed troop movements, and sowed chaos and fear behind enemy lines. The constant bombing would deny the enemy sleep, so they were as much of a psychological warfare tactic as they were effective bombers. The Germans quickly learned to respect and fear them. Any German pilot who managed to shoot down a night witch was automatically awarded an Iron Cross. That's how highly the German army regarded them. They knew the damage these women were doing. The night witches flew over 30,000 sorties during the war. They dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs, destroyed countless enemy vehicles and equipment, and played a crucial role in the Soviet victory. Many of them were awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest distinction in the Soviet Union. They were truly exceptional, but perhaps the most remarkable thing about the night witches is their sheer tenacity and resilience. They flew outdated planes, faced constant danger, and endured unimaginable hardships. They were young women, barely out of their teens, who rose to the challenge and became legends in their own time. Their story is a powerful testament to the courage, determination, and resourcefulness of women in war. It's a story that deserves to be remembered and celebrated. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, even when faced with seemingly insurmountable odds, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. The night witches weren't just soldiers, they were symbols of hope, resistance, and the unwavering spirit of the human will. Sleep tight, knowing that such heroes and legends were once among us. As the Red Army pushed westward, liberating town after town, village after village, the scope of Nazi atrocities began to unfold in a way that few could have truly imagined. The scale of the suffering, the systematic nature of the brutality. It was a horror beyond words, a stain on humanity that would forever mark the 20th century. And at the heart of this horror lay the concentration camps. These weren't just prisons, they were factories of death, meticulously designed to strip individuals of their humanity, to break their spirits, and ultimately, to exterminate entire groups of people. Stories had filtered out, whispers carried on the wind, tales of unimaginable cruelty, but nothing could truly prepare the advancing Soviet soldiers for the reality they encountered. Imagine, if you will, the scene. After days, weeks, sometimes months of fierce fighting, a Red Army unit, exhausted but driven forward, crests a small rise. Before them, a landscape scarred by barbed wire, watchtowers looming against the sky, a scene that would forever be etched into their memories. The smell, that's often the first thing many veterans recall, a sickening, acrid stench that permeated the air for miles, a mixture of burning flesh, disease, and despair that choked the senses. It was a smell that clung to clothing, to skin, a smell that haunted dreams long after the war ended. As they approached, the reality of the situation would begin to dawn on them. Emaciated figures, shuffling like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their bodies skeletal. These were the survivors, the remnants of a system designed to grind them into dust. Their clothes were rags, their feet bare, their spirits broken. The initial reaction was often shock, disbelief. How could human beings treat other human beings in such a way? How could such cruelty exist? Many soldiers, hardened by years of combat, found themselves weeping openly at the sight of these walking skeletons. Eyewitness accounts from Soviet soldiers paint a grim picture. One veteran, a young lieutenant named Dmitry, recalled entering Majdanek concentration camp in Poland. He described finding piles of shoes, mountains of hair, and chambers filled with gas. He wrote in his diary, "I had seen death before, many times, but this was something different. This was not the death of soldiers in battle. This was the industrialization of death, the systematic annihilation of innocence." The liberation of these camps was not a simple act of freeing prisoners. Many were too weak to even stand, let alone celebrate their newfound freedom. Disease was rampant, starvation had taken its toll, and the psychological trauma was immense. Soviet medical teams, often overwhelmed and under-equipped, did their best to provide care, but the needs were staggering. Many of the survivors were unable to comprehend what was happening. They had been stripped of their identities, reduced to numbers, their minds numbed by years of suffering. They didn't know who to trust, who to believe. They had witnessed the very worst of humanity, and it had left them deeply scarred. Beyond the immediate horrors, the liberators uncovered evidence of systematic murder on a scale previously unimaginable. Gas chambers disguised as showers, crematoria working around the clock, mass graves overflowing with bodies. It was a meticulously planned and executed operation of genocide. The discovery of these camps had a profound impact on the Soviet soldiers. It reinforced their determination to defeat Nazi Germany, to rid the world of this evil. It also changed the way they viewed the war. It was no longer just about territory or ideology. It was about saving humanity from barbarism. The process of documenting the atrocities began immediately. Photographers and journalists were brought in to record the horrors for posterity. Soviet authorities were determined to show the world what had happened, to ensure that these crimes would never be forgotten. But even the most graphic photographs and detailed reports could not fully capture the depth of the suffering. The human cost was simply too immense, too profound. The survivors carried the weight of their experiences with them for the rest of their lives, a constant reminder of the depths of human depravity. It is important to remember that the liberation of these camps was not solely a Soviet endeavor. Allied forces on other fronts also played a crucial role in uncovering and shutting down these instruments of death. The fight against Nazi Germany was a collective effort, a global struggle against tyranny and oppression. The stories of survival within these camps are testaments to the resilience of the human spirit. Despite the unimaginable suffering, some individuals found the strength to resist, to help others, to maintain their dignity in the face of overwhelming evil. Their stories are beacons of hope in the darkness, reminders that even in the most horrific circumstances, the human spirit can endure. These stories, often untold or overlooked, are crucial to understanding the full scope of the Eastern Front. It wasn't just about battles and strategies. It was about the human cost of war, the suffering inflicted on innocent civilians, and the enduring power of the human spirit to survive even the most unimaginable horrors. The horrors of Nazi concentration camps served as a stark and brutal reminder of what was at stake, fueling the Red Army's advance westward and solidifying their resolve to defeat the Nazi regime, no matter the cost. It's a chapter of history that must never be forgotten, a chilling reminder of the depths of human depravity and the importance of vigilance in the face of hatred and intolerance. And as we continue to explore these forgotten stories, we must always remember the victims, honor the survivors, and learn from the past to build a better future. Today, we turn our focus to Ukraine, a land steeped in both beauty and unimaginable suffering. Before the boots of German soldiers marched across its fertile fields, before the roar of tanks echoed through its villages, Ukraine had already endured a trauma that would forever scar its people, the Holodomor. The Holodomor, meaning to kill by starvation, was a man-made famine in Soviet Ukraine from 1932 to 1933, a horrific episode in history where millions perished due to the policies of the Soviet government. Imagine a society already weakened, its spirit broken by collectivization, the forced seizure of land and livestock from farmers to create collective farms. This policy, imposed with ruthless efficiency, decimated the traditional agricultural practices of the Ukrainian peasantry. Skilled farmers, the backbone of the nation, were labeled as kulaks or wealthy peasants and systematically persecuted. Their land was confiscated, their homes were destroyed, and they were often deported to Siberia, leaving behind a void in agricultural expertise. The result was catastrophic. Grain quotas were set impossibly high, far exceeding what the land could produce after the disruptions of collectivization. As farmers struggled to meet these unrealistic demands, Soviet authorities seized their remaining grain, even seed grain needed for the next harvest. Homes were ransacked, and hidden reserves were discovered and confiscated, leaving families with nothing. The stories emerging from this time are heartbreaking beyond words. Parents watched helplessly as their children starved, their bodies wasting away before their very eyes. Entire villages were decimated, their populations wiped out by famine. There were reports of cannibalism, a desperate act of survival in the face of utter desperation. People ate anything they could find: bark, roots, leaves, even rodents and insects. The once fertile fields of Ukraine became a graveyard of despair. Estimates vary, but historians believe that millions of Ukrainians perished during the Holodomor. The exact number remains a subject of debate, a painful reminder of the scale of the tragedy. The famine was not simply a natural disaster, it was a politically engineered catastrophe, a deliberate act of cruelty designed to break the spirit of the Ukrainian people. Now fast forward to 1941. The horrors of the Holodomor were still fresh in the minds of many Ukrainians when the German invasion began. The arrival of the Wehrmacht brought a new wave of suffering, but it also presented a complex and morally ambiguous situation. For some, the Germans were seen as liberators, as a potential escape from the oppressive Soviet regime that had inflicted so much pain. They harbored hopes that the Germans would restore their land and their freedom. However, this hope was quickly shattered. The Nazi regime had no intention of liberating Ukraine. They viewed it as a source of resources, a breadbasket to feed the German war machine. The policies of exploitation and brutality continued, albeit under a new flag. The Germans implemented their own system of forced labor, confiscating resources and executing those who resisted. Imagine the predicament of a Ukrainian farmer who had survived the Holodomor, only to face the prospect of starvation once again under German occupation. The land they had desperately clung to was now being stripped bare to feed the invaders. Their families were once again facing hunger, and the threat of violence was ever present. The war brought new forms of suffering. Villagers were caught in the crossfire between the retreating Red Army and the advancing Wehrmacht. Homes were destroyed, and civilians were killed. The Partisan movement, while offering resistance to the German occupation, also brought its own dangers. Villagers suspected of collaborating with the Partisans faced brutal reprisals. The experience of living through both the Holodomor and the Second World War created a unique and unimaginable burden for the Ukrainian people. They were caught between two totalitarian regimes, each inflicting its own brand of suffering. They endured starvation, violence, and oppression on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The Holodomor left a deep scar on the Ukrainian psyche, a wound that has never fully healed. The war only compounded the trauma, adding another layer of suffering to an already devastated nation. For those who survived, the memories of those dark years remained a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring power of the human spirit. Their resilience in the face of such adversity is a testament to their strength and their unwavering determination to rebuild their lives and their nation, even after enduring such unimaginable losses. It's a story of survival against all odds, a somber reminder of the importance of remembering and learning from the past, so that such atrocities never happen again. The Eastern Front swallowed men whole, not just in battles, not just in the vast expanses of frozen wasteland, but also within the grim confines of prisoner of war camps. These camps, often hastily erected and brutally managed, became killing fields in their own right. Disease, starvation, and outright execution were rampant. Hope withered quickly behind the barbed wire, but even in the depths of despair, the human spirit, that remarkable and unpredictable thing, could sometimes flicker, and sometimes, just sometimes, it could burst into flame. Our next story, a tale of resilience and raw survival, unfolds in Poland, within the walls of one such camp. It's the story of a small group of Soviet soldiers who, against impossible odds, dared to dream of freedom, and then, more incredibly, dared to act on it. The camp, let's call it Stalag 318, was a sprawling complex of wooden barracks surrounded by high fences, watchtowers, and the ever-present threat of armed guards. It wasn't one of the notorious death camps. Its primary function was to house and essentially starve captured Soviet soldiers. Rations were meager, consisting of watery soup and small portions of moldy bread. Disease spread like wildfire, and the stench of sickness and death permeated everything. Amidst this misery, a small group of men began to coalesce. They were from different units, different backgrounds, but they shared a common burning desire to escape. The leader, a seasoned sergeant named Dmitri, possessed a quiet strength and a natural charisma that drew others to him. He was a man of few words, but his eyes held a determined glint that inspired confidence. Their plan was audacious, bordering on suicidal. They knew the risks were immense. Discovery meant certain death, but the slow, agonizing demise that awaited them in the camp was equally terrifying. They had nothing left to lose. The escape itself required meticulous planning and unwavering discipline. They spent weeks observing the guards, studying their routines, identifying weaknesses in the security. They learned that one of the guards, a young Polish man forced into service by the Germans, seemed less hardened than the others. They decided to try and make contact. Through subtle gestures and whispered conversations, they managed to convey their intentions to the guard. To their surprise, he was sympathetic. He was a Pole, living under occupation himself, and he harbored a deep resentment towards the Nazis. He agreed to help, providing them with crucial information about the camp layout and the patrol schedules. He also managed to smuggle in a small knife and a crude map of the surrounding area. The night of the escape was dark and moonless. Under the cover of darkness, Dmitri and his men, a handful of brave souls, crept out of their barracks. They moved like shadows, avoiding the watchful eyes of the guards in the towers. The Polish guard had told them of a weak spot in the fence near the latrines. They used the smuggled knife to cut through the wire, creating a small opening. One by one, they slipped through the hole and into the darkness beyond. They were free, but their ordeal was far from over. They were now in Poland, a country under German occupation. They had no food, no weapons, no proper clothing. They were completely reliant on their wits and the kindness of strangers. Their journey was a harrowing odyssey through the Polish countryside. They traveled mostly at night, avoiding roads and sticking to forests and fields. They foraged for food, scavenging what they could find. They were constantly on the lookout for German patrols and collaborators. They encountered both kindness and betrayal. Some Polish farmers, risking their own lives, provided them with food and shelter. Others, fearing the consequences, turned them away, or worse, reported them to the authorities. The moral landscape of occupied Poland was a complex and dangerous terrain. Survival often depended on making impossible choices. One particularly close call occurred when they stumbled upon a German checkpoint. They managed to hide in a nearby barn, barely escaping detection. They could hear the German soldiers searching the area, their voices filled with menace. They held their breath, praying they wouldn't be discovered. After what seemed like an eternity, the soldiers moved on. The journey took them weeks, maybe even months. Time blurred into a relentless cycle of walking, hiding, and scavenging. They were exhausted, hungry, and constantly on edge. But they pressed on, driven by an unwavering belief in their own survival. Their ultimate goal was to reach the Soviet lines, hundreds of miles to the east. They knew it was a long shot, but they refused to give up hope. Eventually, after weeks of hardship and peril, they reached the Vistula River. It was a formidable barrier, heavily guarded by the Germans. But they had no choice. They had to cross it. They found a small, abandoned boat hidden among the reeds. Under the cover of darkness, they pushed the boat into the water and began to row. The current was strong, and the river was wide. They were exposed and vulnerable. Suddenly, a German patrol boat appeared out of the darkness. The soldiers on board opened fire with machine guns. Bullets whizzed around them, tearing holes in the boat. Dmitri and his men returned fire with the few weapons they had managed to acquire. A fierce firefight ensued. The small boat was tossed about in the water, making it difficult to aim. Several of Dmitri's men were hit. The situation looked bleak, but Dmitri refused to surrender. He continued to fight, urging his men to hold on. He knew that their lives depended on it. In a stroke of incredible luck, one of Dmitri's bullets struck the German patrol boat's engine. The boat sputtered and stalled. The German soldiers were forced to abandon ship. Dmitri and his remaining men continued to row, their bodies aching, their spirits weary. They finally reached the other side of the river, collapsing on the bank in exhaustion. They had made it. They were alive, but they knew that their journey was far from over. They still had a long way to go before they reached the safety of the Soviet lines, but they had overcome the impossible. They had escaped from a POW camp and survived a grueling journey through occupied Poland. Their story is a testament to the indomitable spirit of the human being, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can still endure. It is the kind of story, isn't it, that reminds us to keep going, just keep going. The Eastern Front. By 1944, the relentless Soviet advance was pushing the German Wehrmacht back across Eastern Europe. But for the people of Poland, caught between two brutal empires, liberation seemed a distant dream, if not an outright impossibility. Nowhere was this more evident than in Warsaw, the heart of Poland. Occupied since 1939, the city lived under a constant shadow of Nazi terror. We've talked a lot in past episodes about organized military operations, but today we're going to focus on something slightly different: how ordinary citizens stepped up in extraordinary circumstances. The Warsaw Uprising of August 1944 wasn't a planned military campaign in the typical sense. It was a desperate gamble, a spontaneous eruption of defiance fueled by years of oppression, and a glimmer of hope as the Soviet Red Army approached the city. Imagine living under constant threat, seeing your neighbors disappear, and knowing any act of resistance could mean death. That was daily life in Warsaw. The Polish Home Army, or Armia Krajowa, a resistance movement loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, had been preparing for this moment. For years, they'd been gathering weapons, training fighters, and building a clandestine network ready to strike when the time was right. But their resources were limited, and the odds were stacked against them. As the Soviets neared, the Home Army leadership believed that seizing Warsaw before the Red Army arrived would allow the Polish government in exile to establish itself as the legitimate authority, preventing a Soviet takeover. It was a bold, almost desperate calculation. On August 1st, 1944, the uprising began. Imagine the scene. Suddenly, the streets erupted in gunfire. Young men and women, many barely out of their teens, emerged from hiding places, armed with pistols, rifles, and Molotov cocktails. They attacked German positions, raised the Polish flag, and proclaimed the liberation of Warsaw. For a brief moment, it seemed like victory was within reach. The element of surprise was definitely on their side, but the Germans quickly regrouped. The Wehrmacht, a highly trained and well-equipped military force, was far superior to the lightly armed Home Army. The uprising, initially successful in capturing parts of the city, soon bogged down into a brutal urban battle. Street by street, house by house, the fighting raged. The civilian population of Warsaw, numbering hundreds of thousands, became trapped in the crossfire. Imagine the terror of living in a city under siege, with artillery shells raining down, buildings collapsing, and snipers lurking on every corner. Food and water became scarce. Medical supplies ran out. Makeshift hospitals were set up in cellars and basements, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of wounded. The situation was made even more dire by the Soviet advance. As the uprising raged, the Red Army halted its offensive on the outskirts of Warsaw. Stalin, suspicious of the Polish Home Army and unwilling to support a movement loyal to the government in exile, refused to provide assistance. This decision, which remains highly controversial to this day, sealed the fate of the uprising. The Home Army fought bravely, but they were outgunned and outnumbered. They relied on captured weapons, homemade explosives, and the unwavering support of the civilian population. Imagine digging trenches in the streets, building barricades from rubble, and risking your life to deliver food and supplies to the fighters. Every single day, citizens were showing bravery. One aspect of the uprising that often gets overlooked is the role of women. They served as nurses, messengers, and even combatants. They smuggled weapons, cared for the wounded, and maintained communication lines. They were the backbone of the resistance. As the weeks passed, the German response became increasingly brutal. The Wehrmacht systematically destroyed Warsaw, block by block. Buildings were set on fire, hospitals were bombed, and civilians were massacred. The Nazis implemented a policy of collective punishment, targeting entire neighborhoods for reprisal. Imagine seeing your home, your city, your entire world reduced to rubble. Imagine the despair of knowing that your loved ones were dying around you, and there was nothing you could do to save them. The stories that emerged from Warsaw were nothing short of horrific. The Warsaw Uprising lasted for 63 days. 63 days of unimaginable suffering, relentless fighting, and unwavering courage. Finally, on October 2nd, 1944, the Home Army surrendered. The terms were harsh. The surviving fighters were sent to POW camps, and the civilian population was expelled from the city. But the worst was yet to come. On Hitler's orders, Warsaw was to be completely destroyed. German engineers systematically demolished what was left of the city, using explosives and flamethrowers. Historic buildings, cultural landmarks, and residential areas were all razed to the ground. Imagine the scale of that destruction, the systematic erasure of a city's history and identity. By the end of the war, Warsaw was a ghost town. An estimated 85% of the city had been destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people had been killed, both fighters and civilians. The Warsaw Uprising was a tragedy of immense proportions, a testament to the brutality of war and the resilience of the human spirit. The story of the Warsaw Uprising serves as a sobering reminder of the consequences of occupation and the desperation that can drive ordinary people to take extraordinary risks. It also highlights the complex political dynamics of the Eastern Front and the tragic choices that had to be made. It is a story of courage, sacrifice, and ultimately, devastating loss. A story that we really shouldn't forget. It's a tough one, I know, but really important. Welcome back, friends. Tonight we delve into a cauldron of fire and steel, the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history. A clash so immense, so brutally decisive, that it helped turn the tide of the war on the Eastern Front. Imagine, if you will, a landscape stretching for miles, shimmering under the summer sun, about to be ripped apart by the fury of thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. After the devastating winter counteroffensives of 1942 to 43, which culminated in the encirclement and eventual defeat of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, the Eastern Front had stabilized, albeit precariously. A large bulge or salient formed around the city of Kursk, held by Soviet forces. This Kursk salient represented a tempting target for the Germans, a chance to regain the initiative and cripple the Red Army. The German plan, codenamed Operation Citadel, was audacious in its scale. They intended to pinch off the Kursk salient with two powerful pincer movements, cutting off and destroying the Soviet forces within. Spearheading this offensive were the latest and most formidable German tanks, the Panzer VI or Tiger, a heavily armored behemoth with a deadly 80mm gun, and the Panzer IV or Panther, a more agile but equally lethal machine. These new tanks were meant to shatter the Soviet defenses and pave the way for a decisive victory. But the Soviets were not caught unawares. Forewarned by their intelligence networks, including the famous spy ring known as the Red Orchestra, they knew exactly what was coming. Months were spent preparing a layered defense of unprecedented depth. Think of it as a series of concentric rings, each one bristling with anti-tank guns, mines, trenches, and fortified positions. Behind these fortifications were hundreds of thousands of soldiers, supported by artillery, and crucially, a growing number of tanks. The Soviets understood that they couldn't simply stop the German offensive. They had to bleed it dry to grind down the German panzer divisions until they were exhausted and vulnerable. The aim was to turn the Kursk salient into a killing field. The battle began on July 5, 1943. The initial German onslaught was ferocious. The Tigers and Panthers, supported by Stuka dive bombers, tore into the first lines of Soviet defenses. The ground shook under the thunderous roar of engines and explosions. Tank battles erupted across the open fields, clouds of dust and smoke obscuring the carnage. Imagine being inside a Soviet T-34 tank at that moment. The T-34, while a capable machine, was often outgunned and out-armored by the latest German tanks. The crew would be crammed into a tight, claustrophobic space, the air thick with the smell of diesel and gunpowder, the constant jolting and jarring of the tank, the deafening noise of gunfire, the ever-present fear of being hit. It must have been a truly terrifying experience. One Soviet tank commander, a young lieutenant named Vasily, recalled later that the first few days were a blur of desperate fighting. His tank platoon was constantly on the move, trying to plug gaps in the defensive line, engaging German tanks in close-quarters combat. He saw tanks explode in flames, their crews trapped inside. He saw comrades fall, their lives cut short in an instant. It was like a nightmare, Vasily said. The sky was filled with the black crosses of the German planes, and the earth trembled under the tracks of their tanks. We fought like lions, but they kept coming, wave after wave. The fighting was especially intense around the small town of Prokhorovka. On July 12th, the largest tank battle in history unfolded on the fields outside Prokhorovka. Hundreds of tanks, both German and Soviet, clashed in a chaotic melee. The ground was churned into a muddy wasteland, littered with burning wreckage and the shattered remains of tanks. The close range negated some of the German tanks' advantages. The more nimble T-34s could get in close and exploit the Tigers' and Panthers' blind spots. But the fighting was brutal, and the losses were staggering on both sides. Stories abound of individual acts of courage and sacrifice, of Soviet tank crews ramming their burning vehicles into German tanks, sacrificing themselves to destroy the enemy, of anti-tank gunners standing their ground, firing their guns until they were overrun, of infantry soldiers charging into the fray with grenades and Molotov cocktails, determined to stop the German advance at any cost. One particularly harrowing account tells of a Soviet anti-tank rifle team, positioned in a trench, who held off a squadron of German tanks for several hours. They fired their rifles until their ammunition ran out, then resorted to throwing grenades and even rocks at the advancing tanks. They were eventually overwhelmed, but their courageous stand bought valuable time for other Soviet units to prepare their defenses. Despite their initial gains, the Germans were unable to break through the Soviet defenses. The sheer scale of the Soviet resistance, the depth of their fortifications, and the heavy losses they inflicted on the German panzer divisions began to take their toll. As the battle raged, the Soviets launched their own counteroffensives, further stretching German resources and manpower. The German High Command realized that Operation Citadel was failing. The losses were unsustainable, and the strategic situation was deteriorating. On July 17th, Hitler ordered the cancellation of Operation Citadel. The German offensive had stalled, and the Red Army had emerged victorious from the largest tank battle in history. Kursk marked a turning point in the war on the Eastern Front. The initiative had passed irrevocably to the Soviets, and from that point forward, the Red Army would steadily push the Germans back towards Berlin. The Battle of Kursk was a brutal and costly affair, a testament to the immense scale and ferocity of the war on the Eastern Front. It was a battle fought by ordinary men and women, pushed to their limits, fighting for their survival and the survival of their nation. Their stories, often forgotten, deserve to be remembered. And perhaps, in remembering them, we can gain a deeper understanding of the human cost of war and the importance of striving for peace. The Eastern Front, we've talked about the vast distances, the unflinching brutality, the sheer scale of suffering. But there's one element that amplified every horror, turned every hardship into a fight for survival against something even more relentless than the enemy, the Russian winter. Imagine, if you will, temperatures plummeting far below freezing, dropping to levels most of us can barely comprehend. -30, -40 degrees Celsius. The air itself feels like it's trying to claw its way into your lungs, to freeze you from the inside out. And this wasn't just a few isolated cold snaps. This was months of unending bitter cold, punctuated by blizzards that could blind and disorient even the most experienced soldier. For the German invaders, used to the relatively milder winters of Western Europe, this was a completely alien and devastating experience. They were simply not prepared. Their uniforms, their equipment, their tactics, everything was geared towards a summer campaign. The rapid advances of Operation Barbarossa had lulled them into a false sense of security, a belief that the war would be over before the real cold set in. How wrong they were. Accounts from German soldiers paint a vivid picture of the suffering. Men freezing to death in their foxholes, their bodies stiff and contorted in unnatural poses, weapons jamming, vehicles grinding to a halt, immobilized by the ice, engines that refused to start, leaving entire units stranded, exposed to the elements and vulnerable to attack. Fuel lines freezing solid, rendering tanks and trucks useless. Even the simple act of firing a rifle became a challenge, as the grease in the mechanisms thickened and froze, causing malfunctions and misfires. The cold wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a killer. Frostbite became rampant, claiming fingers, toes, ears, noses, leaving soldiers permanently maimed and disfigured. Amputations were common, often performed in makeshift field hospitals with inadequate supplies and anesthesia. The cries of men undergoing these agonizing procedures must have echoed across the frozen landscape, a constant reminder of the winter's relentless grip. And it wasn't just the cold itself. The lack of proper winter clothing exacerbated the problem. Many German soldiers were still wearing their summer uniforms well into the depths of winter. They layered whatever they could find, newspapers, rags, even straw, beneath their thin coats, desperate to ward off the encroaching chill. But it was rarely enough. Food became scarce. Supply lines, already stretched thin by the vast distances, were further hampered by the snow and ice. Trucks became bogged down in drifts, and trains were delayed by blizzards and sabotage. Soldiers went hungry for days, their bodies weakened and their morale shattered. Imagine trying to fight a war, to stay alert and focused when your stomach is gnawing with hunger and your body is shivering uncontrollably. The Soviet soldiers, of course, were also suffering, but they had several advantages. They were more accustomed to the harsh winters. Many were recruited from regions where extreme cold was a fact of life. They had better winter clothing, often consisting of thick felt boots, valenki, warm fur hats, ushankas and quilted jackets, talogrekas, and they were fighting on their own soil, defending their homes and families. This gave them a resilience, a determination that the invaders simply couldn't match. Even with these advantages, survival was a constant struggle. The Red Army faced the same logistical challenges as the Germans. Supply lines were stretched, and food was often scarce. Soldiers endured the same freezing temperatures, the same brutal blizzards. But the Soviets adapted. They became masters of winter warfare. They learned to navigate the frozen landscape, to to camouflage themselves in the snow, to use the weather to their advantage. They ambushed German units from behind snowdrifts, launched surprise attacks in the midst of blizzards, and used the icy terrain to bog down enemy vehicles. Stories abound of incredible resilience and ingenuity, of soldiers sharing their meager rations with each other, of comrades huddling together for warmth, of doctors performing life-saving surgeries in freezing conditions, of entire villages banding together to support the war effort, providing food, shelter, and medical care to the soldiers passing through. One particularly harrowing account tells of a Soviet tank crew trapped inside their disabled vehicle for days during a blizzard. The engine had frozen solid, and they were running out of fuel and food. To stay alive, they burned everything they could find inside the tank: maps, documents, even their own clothing. They huddled together for warmth, rationing their last scraps of food and water. When the blizzard finally subsided and rescuers reached them, they were barely alive, but they had survived. The winter campaigns of the Eastern Front were a crucible, testing the limits of human endurance. They were a brutal reminder of the power of nature and the importance of adaptation. They were a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to endure unimaginable hardship and still find the strength to fight on. The frozen battlefields of Russia became a graveyard, not just for soldiers, but for the dreams of conquest. The winter didn't pick a side, it attacked both, grinding down the strength and will of the German invaders and testing the mettle of the Soviet defenders. It left an indelible mark on the landscape and on the memories of those who survived, a chilling reminder of the brutal realities of war. Hello there, and welcome back. Tonight, let's turn our attention to some remarkable stories of resilience and compassion amidst the unimaginable horrors of the Eastern Front. We'll be focusing on the medical personnel, the doctors and nurses, who performed what can only be described as miracles under the most dreadful of circumstances. The Eastern Front was a meat grinder, a relentless onslaught that dwarfed even the Western Front in its scale of suffering and brutality. Medical facilities were often overwhelmed, under-equipped, and constantly targeted by enemy fire. Doctors and nurses worked around the clock, often without sleep, operating by candlelight and rationing already scarce medical supplies. Imagine the scene: a makeshift field hospital, perhaps a bombed-out schoolhouse or a repurposed barn, filled with the moans of wounded soldiers. The air thick with the smell of blood, disinfectant, and the ever-present fear of another air raid. Under these conditions, acts of courage and ingenuity became commonplace, born out of necessity and a deep-seated commitment to saving lives. One story that always sticks with me is that of Dr. Vera Gedrits. Before the war, she was one of Russia's first female surgeons and a pioneer in abdominal surgery. But on the Eastern Front, she found herself facing a different kind of challenge altogether. Wounded soldiers were pouring in faster than she could possibly treat them. There wasn't time for textbook procedures. Dr. Gedrits made a daring decision to perform surgeries right on the battlefield, as close to the front lines as possible. She reasoned that the delay in transporting the wounded to rear hospitals was costing countless lives. She organized mobile surgical units, following the advancing and retreating armies, performing amputations, repairing shattered bones, and stopping hemorrhages under the constant threat of shelling and gunfire. Her techniques were revolutionary for the time. She advocated for early surgical intervention, believing that prompt treatment, even in rudimentary conditions, was better than waiting for ideal circumstances that would never arrive. She used whatever materials she could find: splints fashioned from branches, bandages made from bedsheets, and even vodka as an antiseptic when supplies ran low. Another truly remarkable story is that of the Soviet nurses. These women, many of them barely out of their teens, faced dangers equal to, if not greater than, the soldiers they tended to. They braved enemy fire to drag wounded men from the battlefield, often carrying them for miles on their backs. They endured freezing temperatures, starvation, and constant bombardments. One such nurse, Maria Borovichenko, became a legend for her bravery and selflessness. During a fierce battle, she single-handedly rescued dozens of wounded soldiers, braving a hail of bullets and artillery shells. She even used her own body to shield a wounded officer from an exploding grenade, saving his life at the cost of her own. She was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. These nurses weren't just providing medical care, they were offering comfort, hope, and a human connection in a world that had become dehumanized. They wrote letters home for the wounded, read them stories, and simply listened to their fears and anxieties. They were mothers, sisters, and friends to soldiers far from home, facing unimaginable trauma. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, and the medical personnel of the Eastern Front were masters of improvisation. With limited resources, they found creative solutions to seemingly insurmountable problems. Blood transfusions, for example, were often performed directly from one soldier to another, a risky but sometimes life-saving procedure. Doctors used maggots to clean wounds, a practice that, while seemingly grotesque, was remarkably effective at preventing infection. They learned to diagnose injuries by touch and instinct, relying on their experience and intuition in the absence of proper diagnostic tools. The psychological toll on these medical professionals was immense. They witnessed horrific injuries and unimaginable suffering on a daily basis. They were forced to make impossible choices, deciding who lived and who died based on the limited resources available. Many suffered from what we now recognize as PTSD, haunted by the memories of the war long after it ended. Despite the trauma, the medical personnel of the Eastern Front persevered, driven by a sense of duty and a profound empathy for their fellow human beings. They embodied the best of humanity in the face of the worst of circumstances. Their stories are a testament to the power of compassion, resilience, and the unwavering human spirit. They are a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can still be found in the acts of kindness and sacrifice. Think for a moment of the sheer courage it took to stand in the middle of a battlefield, knowing that death could strike at any moment, and to continue tending to the wounded, offering comfort and fighting to save lives. These doctors and nurses were not just healers, they were heroes, plain and simple. They represent the best of us. And their stories, well, their stories deserve to be remembered and told. Their sacrifices are a reminder that even in the midst of the most terrible conflicts humanity can endure. And perhaps, as we reflect on their bravery and their dedication, we can find a little bit of that same spirit within ourselves. A little bit of that courage, that compassion, that unwavering commitment to helping others, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Because ultimately, that's what these stories are all about, the enduring power of the human spirit. And with that, I think it's time to let these stories settle. Let them wash over you. Let them remind you of the inherent good that exists, even in the darkest corners of history. Sleep well. Welcome back, friends. We've journeyed through some truly harrowing experiences on the Eastern Front, witnessing acts of incredible bravery and unimaginable suffering. But the battles didn't always end when the guns fell silent. For many, a new, invisible war began within. Today, we'll gently explore the psychological scars left by the conflict, the profound impact of PTSD, and the long, often lonely, road to recovery. The Eastern Front, perhaps more than any other theatre of World War II, was an arena of extreme violence and brutality. Soldiers on both sides witnessed unspeakable horrors, massacres of civilians, the systematic destruction of towns and villages, and the relentless, dehumanizing attrition of constant combat. The sheer scale of death and destruction was unlike anything seen before. And while physical wounds could heal, the mental wounds often lingered, festering beneath the surface. In the years following the war, the term post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD as we know it now, wasn't yet widely recognized or understood. Many returning soldiers struggled in silence, their symptoms dismissed as shell shock, war neurosis, or simply weakness of character. They were expected to reintegrate into society, to pick up where they left off, to forget the horrors they had witnessed. But for so many, forgetting was simply impossible. Imagine, if you will, a young Soviet soldier, barely out of his teens, thrust into the maelstrom of Operation Barbarossa. He watches his friends fall, cut down by machine gun fire. He endures weeks of relentless retreat, witnessing the devastation of his homeland. He's forced to kill, to survive, in a world where the lines between right and wrong become increasingly blurred. And then, miraculously, he survives. He makes it home. But the images, the sounds, the smells, they remain. They replay in his mind, unbidden, night after night. He might experience vivid flashbacks, feeling as though he's back on the battlefield, reliving the terror. He might suffer from debilitating nightmares, waking in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest. He might become hypervigilant, constantly on edge, startled by sudden noises, unable to relax. Everyday sounds, a car backfiring, a distant explosion from construction, could trigger intense anxiety and panic. And there were other, less obvious symptoms: emotional numbness, a sense of detachment from loved ones, difficulty concentrating, irritability, and outbursts of anger, a profound sense of guilt and shame, particularly for those who felt they had failed to protect their comrades or their families. Some turned to alcohol or other substances to numb the pain, further compounding their problems. The lack of understanding and support made the situation even more difficult. Many veterans were reluctant to talk about their experiences, fearing they would be judged or seen as weak. They bottled up their emotions, isolating themselves from their families and friends. Wives, mothers, and children often bore the brunt of their unspoken suffering, struggling to understand the changes in their loved ones. But amidst this darkness, there were glimmers of hope. Some doctors and psychiatrists, even in the immediate post-war years, began to recognize the unique challenges faced by veterans. They started to develop therapeutic approaches to help them process their trauma and begin the long road to healing. Group therapy, for example, provided a safe space for veterans to share their experiences and realize they were not alone. Talking about their trauma, while incredibly difficult, could be cathartic, helping them to confront their demons and begin to heal. Some found solace in creative outlets, expressing their emotions through art, music, or writing. Others found comfort in religion or spirituality. It's important to remember that recovery from PTSD is a journey, not a destination. There are good days and bad days, setbacks and breakthroughs. There is no quick fix, no magic cure, but with the right support, with compassion and understanding, it is possible to find a way to live with the scars of war, to rebuild a life, and to find meaning and purpose once again. The stories of the Eastern Front are often filled with tales of heroism and sacrifice, but let's also remember the silent suffering of those who returned home with invisible wounds. Let us honor their courage by acknowledging their pain, by offering them our support, and by striving to create a world where mental health is given the same importance as physical health. Because the echoes of war can last for generations, rippling through families and communities. By understanding the psychological impact of conflict, we can better support those who have served and work towards a future where the horrors of war are never forgotten, but never repeated. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until next time, sleep well. The guns fell silent, finally. The earth, scarred and soaked in blood, began to breathe again. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was a silence filled with absence, with a hollow echo of what had been lost. The Eastern Front, after years of unimaginable brutality, had ceased to be a battlefield, but it remained a graveyard, a monument to sacrifice, and a land profoundly altered. For the survivors, the war didn't truly end with the signing of treaties and the triumphant parades. It continued in the agonizing search for loved ones, a desperate scramble to piece together shattered families and communities. Millions were displaced, wandering the ravaged landscape, clutching faded photographs, and whispering names into the uncaring wind. Imagine the scene: train stations overflowing with people, faces etched with anxiety and hope, notices plastered everywhere, handwritten pleas, official lists, photographs, a desperate attempt to locate missing fathers, brothers, sisters, children. The air thick with the smell of coal smoke and the unspoken fear that their loved ones were gone forever. The Soviet Union established elaborate, though often overwhelmed, tracing services. Bureaus were set up in every major city, tasked with sifting through mountains of information, cross-referencing names, and attempting to match refugees with their families. These offices, staffed by dedicated but exhausted volunteers, became a beacon of hope, a place where people clung to the possibility, however slim, of a happy reunion. But the process was agonizingly slow. Records were incomplete, destroyed, or simply non-existent. The chaos of war had swallowed entire units, leaving behind only vague rumors and unanswered questions. The sheer scale of the loss was staggering. How could you begin to search for someone among tens of millions of missing? And then there were the letters, carefully worded, often censored, messages that trickled back from hospitals, POW camps, and distant corners of the Soviet Union. Each letter a potential source of joy or heartbreak. A simple line, alive and well, recovering in, could bring a family to its knees in gratitude. But the absence of a letter, the deafening silence, was a torment all its own. Consider the story of Anna Petrovna, a young woman from Minsk. When the Germans invaded, her husband, Dmitry, was conscripted into the Red Army. She never saw him again. For years, she wrote letters, tirelessly searching for any information. She visited countless tracing offices, only to be met with the same frustrating answer: no information available. Then, one day, a letter arrived. It wasn't from Dmitry. It was from a fellow soldier, a man who had served alongside him in the desperate fighting around Smolensk. The letter contained the news Anna had dreaded for so long. Dmitry had been killed in action, defending a small village against a German tank attack. His body was never recovered. Anna's story, sadly, was not unique. Millions of women, children, and elderly parents faced the same crushing reality. The war had taken their loved ones, leaving behind a void that could never be filled. But amidst the grief and despair, there were also moments of extraordinary joy, of miraculous reunions that defied all odds. Tales of families reunited after years of separation, of children recognizing their parents amidst the crowds of refugees, of long-lost brothers finding each other on the streets of ruined cities. One such story is that of two brothers, Sergei and Ivan, who were separated during the evacuation of Leningrad. Sergei, the younger brother, was placed on a train heading east, while Ivan stayed behind with their mother. They lost contact during the chaos of the siege. For years, each brother believed the other to be dead. Then, after the war, Sergei, now a young man, decided to travel back to Leningrad, hoping to find any trace of his family. As he walked through the city, now slowly being rebuilt, he saw a familiar face in the crowd. It was Ivan. The two brothers rushed towards each other, embracing in a tearful reunion. They had both survived the war, against all odds. Their mother, sadly, had perished during the siege, but they had found each other, a small spark of hope in a world still shrouded in darkness. These reunions, however rare, served as a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, of the enduring bonds of family and love. They offered a glimmer of hope in the face of unimaginable loss, a testament to the fact that even in the darkest of times, the human heart can still find a way to heal. But the war left scars that ran deeper than physical wounds. The psychological trauma, the PTSD we now understand, was widespread. Soldiers returning from the front often struggled to readjust to civilian life, haunted by memories of the horrors they had witnessed. Families were torn apart by grief, by the inability to cope with the loss of loved ones. Many survivors felt a profound sense of guilt, a feeling that they had somehow failed to protect their families, that they had not done enough to prevent the tragedy that had befallen them. This guilt, often unspoken, weighed heavily on their hearts, adding to the burden of their suffering. And so, the aftermath of the Eastern Front was a complex tapestry of grief, hope, and resilience, a time of searching, of mourning, of rebuilding, a time when the survivors struggled to make sense of the unimaginable horrors they had witnessed, and to find a way to move forward, to create a future for themselves and their children. A future built on the foundations of remembrance, on the solemn promise that such a tragedy would never be allowed to happen again. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey through the harrowing landscapes and forgotten battles of the Eastern Front. We've witnessed incredible resilience, unbearable loss, and the sheer will to survive against all odds. These weren't just battles fought on maps, they were human stories etched in blood, sweat, and tears, stories often overshadowed by the broader narrative of World War II. Think back to those first days of Operation Barbarossa, the Soviet soldiers facing the seemingly unstoppable Wehrmacht, often with inadequate training and obsolete equipment. Remember the desperate escapes from encirclement, the grueling marches through forests and swamps, the constant threat of capture or death. These weren't just statistics, they were fathers, sons, brothers, husbands fighting for their homeland, fighting for their families, fighting for their very existence. Consider the partisans, the ordinary villagers who took up arms against the German occupiers, facing brutal reprisals for every act of defiance. Imagine the courage it took to harbor escaped prisoners of war, to sabotage enemy infrastructure, to risk everything for the sake of freedom. And think of Zoya Kosmodomyanskaya, a young woman whose defiance in the face of torture and execution made her a symbol of Soviet resistance. Remember the unimaginable suffering endured during the siege of Leningrad, the starvation, the disease, the constant bombardment. Visualize the frozen bodies lining the streets, the desperate attempts to find food, the unwavering spirit of the people who refused to surrender. The road of life across frozen Lake Ladoga, a lifeline that barely sustained the city, stands as a testament to human ingenuity and determination. And what of the children of the Eastern Front, orphaned and forced to fend for themselves, witnessing horrors no child should ever see? Their resilience, their ability to adapt and survive in the face of unimaginable adversity, is both heartbreaking and inspiring. Their childhoods were stolen, replaced by the grim realities of war. Let's not forget the crucial role played by women on the Eastern Front, not just as nurses and support staff, but as combat soldiers, pilots, and snipers. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the Lady Death, stands as a testament to their skill and courage, a reminder that women fought and died alongside men in the defense of their country. Even within the ranks of the Wehrmacht, there were those who dissented, who opposed the Nazi regime and sought to undermine its war effort. Their stories of defection and resistance, though often overlooked, offer a glimpse of hope amidst the darkness. They remind us that even in the most oppressive regimes, there are always individuals who choose to stand up for what is right. The Battle of Stalingrad, a turning point in the war, was a cauldron of unimaginable suffering and destruction. Imagine the soldiers fighting hand to hand in the ruins of the city, the constant explosions, the deafening roar of artillery, the sheer terror of urban warfare. The losses on both sides were staggering, a testament to the brutality and futility of war. Think of the pilots who crashed behind enemy lines, the desperate struggle to evade capture and rejoin their comrades. Imagine the constant fear, the reliance on the kindness of strangers, the unwavering determination to return to the fight. And let's acknowledge the moral ambiguity of survival in occupied territories, the difficult choices people faced, the compromises sacrifices they made to protect themselves and their families. Collaboration and betrayal were often intertwined, blurring the lines between right and wrong, making it difficult to judge those who simply sought to survive. The Night Witches, the all-female Soviet bomber regiment, defied expectations and struck fear into the hearts of the German soldiers. Their courage and skill in the air, flying outdated biplanes, challenged traditional gender roles and proved that women could be just as effective in combat as men. As the Red Army advanced westward, they uncovered the horrors of Nazi concentration camps, witnessing firsthand the atrocities committed against millions of innocent people. The scale of the Holocaust, the systematic extermination of Jews, Roma, and other minority groups, remains a stark reminder of the depths of human depravity. The Ukrainian famine, the Holodomor, a man-made catastrophe that preceded and continued during the war, added another layer of tragedy to the already devastated landscape. Millions starved to death as a result of Soviet policies, a horrific event that continues to haunt the Ukrainian people. Consider the grueling journeys of those who escaped from POW camps, the desperate attempts to avoid capture, the reliance on the kindness of strangers, the constant threat of betrayal. Their stories of resilience and determination are a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure even the most extreme hardships. The Warsaw Uprising, a desperate attempt by the Polish resistance to liberate their city from German occupation, was met with brutal reprisals. The city was reduced to rubble, and thousands of civilians were killed. The uprising serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made by the Polish people in their fight for freedom. The Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, was a clash of titans, a desperate struggle for dominance on the Eastern Front. Imagine the deafening roar of engines, the thunder of artillery, the constant threat of being crushed by a tank. It was a battle of attrition, a test of endurance, that ultimately turned the tide of the war in favor of the Soviet Union. And let's not forget the brutal winter campaigns, the fighting and surviving in sub-zero temperatures, the frostbite, the disease, the sheer misery of existence in the frozen wasteland. The Eastern Front was a theater of war, unlike any other, where the weather itself was a deadly enemy. The stories of courageous doctors and nurses who performed medical miracles on the battlefield, often with limited resources, are truly inspiring. Their dedication to saving lives, their willingness to risk their own safety, is a testament to the power of compassion in the face of unimaginable suffering. Finally, we must acknowledge the psychological scars of war, the PTSD that haunted so many veterans long after the fighting had ended. The Eastern Front was a traumatic experience that left a lasting impact on the lives of those who fought there. In the aftermath of the war, many families were torn apart, their loved ones lost or missing. The search for lost relatives, the reunions and the bitter disappointments were all part of the long and difficult process of healing and rebuilding. So what lessons can we learn from these forgotten stories of the Eastern Front? Perhaps the most important is the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to endure unimaginable hardships and emerge, scarred but unbroken. These stories remind us of the importance of empathy, of understanding the suffering of others, of recognizing our shared humanity. They challenge us to confront the horrors of war and to work towards a more peaceful world. They also serve as a stark reminder of the price of freedom, the sacrifices made by those who fought and died on the Eastern Front. Let us never forget their courage, their resilience, and their unwavering determination to survive. And as we reflect on these stories, let us remember that history is not just about battles and dates, but about the lives of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Their stories deserve to be told, their sacrifices deserve to be honored, and their memory deserves to live on.